Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Case 1. On a chilly morning at the start of January, cold air blanketed London as an elderly man strolled leisurely along the narrow canal at the foot of the Tower of London. A thick mist covered the ground, and the bitterly cold wind cut through like a knife, causing him to huddle deeper into his old coat. Suddenly, the barking of stray dogs shattered the silence. The dogs, about 3 or 4 of them, had gathered in a corner near the canal, sniffing and growling frantically. Curiosity slowed the man's steps, his eyes squinting in suspicion. What are they doing? He wondered to himself. As he got closer, he detected a strange foul stench. Cautiously, he took a few more steps, and the scene before him made him weak in the knees. Lying motionless in the grass by the roadside was the body of a young girl. The victim had been brutally attacked, her face horribly mutilated, her body covered in countless wounds, and most terrifying of all, her chest had been torn open. The man stumbled as he ran toward the police box, the horrifying image he had just witnessed still haunting his mind. Upon arriving, he gasped for breath, sweat pouring down his forehead, and his body trembling uncontrollably. The body, a girl, by the canal. The man tried to report the incident to the police. As soon as they received the news, the police quickly dispatched an investigation team to the scene. When the investigative team stepped out of their vehicle, the gruesome sight before them sent chills down everyone's spine. The scene when the authorities arrived was horrifying. The semi-naked body of the girl was covered in numerous wounds from her face to her legs, inflicted by a knife. The victim had also been sexually assaulted before her death. Her skull had been shattered, and her blood-soaked blonde hair clung to her head. When the detectives opened her sweater, they staggered in utter horror. The victim's chest had been torn open, her heart was missing, and several internal organs were also gone. The strangest and most suspicious thing was that, despite the grotesque scene, there was not a single trace of blood. The area surrounding the body was eerily clean. The investigation team immediately hypothesized that the girl had been killed elsewhere, and her body was later moved to this location. But the most chilling thought was that the killer may have drained her blood before transporting the victim here. This idea sent a cold shiver through everyone present at the scene, who could carry out such a cruel and bizarre act. While the police were still searching for clues and had yet to identify the victim, suddenly, from the crowd of onlookers gathered around the scene, a man with a pale, terrified face rushed straight toward the young girl's body. The man could no longer maintain his composure. His legs trembled, and then he collapsed to the ground in utter despair. He sobbed uncontrollably, his trembling hands reaching out toward the girl as he cried out in anguish. "Oh, Pamela!" That man was none other than Edward Theodore Chalmers Werner, a resident of the prestigious Legation Quarter. His sudden appearance left the police even more bewildered. Before the investigators, Werner admitted that the victim was indeed Pamela Werner, his adopted daughter, whom he loved like his own flesh and blood. In his desperate state, Edward Werner tearfully revealed that his daughter, Pamela Werner, had gone missing the night before. All night long, there had been no clues, no sign of the girl. He recounted that they had searched everywhere, but no one had imagined that this horrific end was waiting for them. The shocking murder, with its gruesome details, spread fear throughout the public. People shuddered at the sheer brutality of the crime committed by the killer. The victim's identity was quickly confirmed. The young girl, only 17 years old, was named Pamela Werner, the adopted daughter of Edward Theodore Chalmers Werner, a former British consul in Beijing, China. Edward had adopted Pamela from an orphanage in Beijing after learning that his wife, Gladys Nina, was unable to have children. From the moment he welcomed the little girl into his family, Edward saw Pamela as his joy, the only light in his life. He cherished his daughter as if she were a priceless gift bestowed upon him by life. But fate was not kind, and when Pamela was just 5 years old, her adoptive mother, Gladys, passed away due to illness. At that time, Edward, only 49 years old, was left to raise Pamela on his own, overcoming hardships to ensure her upbringing. Under Edward's care and love, Pamela grew up in a wealthy, upper-class environment, surrounded by people of high social standing. She not only blossomed into a beautiful young woman with a radiant appearance, but she also became someone with an independent, strong, and confident mindset. Pamela captivated many with her strong personality and sharp intellect, earning admiration from those around her. On that fateful evening, The sky over London was covered with ominous dark clouds, and the cold air crept through every alley, as if signaling that something terrible was about to happen. Pamela and her two close friends had spent the afternoon ice skating at a crowded rink in the city. Laughter echoed, the sound of skates gliding on the ice filled the air. It was a peaceful and joyous scene, but no one could have imagined that this would be the last evening they would see Pamela alive. When the clock struck 7 p.m., the sky was pitch black, with only the dim streetlights and the piercing cold remaining. The three young girls said their goodbyes, preparing to leave the rink. Pamela's two friends couldn't help but feel uneasy as they noticed the darkening skies and the deserted streets. They turned to Pamela and asked, "Aren't you afraid to go home alone? It's dark now, and the streets are so cold and empty." With a confident smile, Pamela responded lightly. "London is the safest city in the world," she said, her tone firm, as if it were an indisputable truth. She cheerfully slung her ice skates over her shoulder, climbed onto her bicycle, and rode off. "Whoa, look there!" That night, as the clock struck 8 p.m., Edward Werner sat quietly in the living room, waiting for Pamela to return. The old armchair by the fireplace, where he always sat every evening, was his usual spot as he watched the door, anticipating the sound of his beloved daughter's footsteps. But tonight, something was different. It was already past the time Pamela should have been home, and a vague sense of anxiety began to creep into his heart. Edward kept glancing at the clock on the wall. As the hours passed, his worry grew. Unable to sit still any longer, he decided to send the servant to the ice rink, where Pamela had said she would be with her friends, to look for her. However, several hours later, the servant returned with a disappointed look. There was no trace of Pamela. She wasn't at the rink, and no one had seen her since she left. Fear surged in Edward's heart like a tidal wave. No longer able to just wait, he grabbed a flashlight and stepped out of the house, searching every street and alley in the dark. The bitter night wind lashed at his face, but he didn't care. Edward's eyes scanned the darkness constantly, hoping to catch a glimpse of his daughter. He searched from street to street, from square to small alley, but there was no sign of Pamela. The next morning, when he heard rumors of a horrifying murder discovered near the canal at the foot of the Tower of London, Edward froze. An indescribable sense of dread washed over him, and he felt as if his body had turned to ice. He rushed to the scene, praying that the victim wasn't his daughter. But when he saw the tangled blonde hair beneath the tarp, Edward realized the terrible truth. It was Pamela, his beloved daughter, whom he had spent his life caring for and protecting. The autopsy revealed that Pamela had died from a brain hemorrhage. She had been struck multiple times on the head with a blunt object, the blows so powerful that her skull was fractured. Given the distance and the force of the attack, the examiners concluded that the perpetrator must have been someone known to the victim. After taking Pamela's life, the killer broke her arms and used a sword, about 10 centimeters in length, to mutilate her body. All of Pamela's muscles were severely damaged, and her internal organs were completely missing. The killer had used a sword with great precision and skill, leading investigators to suspect that the perpetrator might be a surgeon. Initially, all suspicions pointed to Edward Werner, the victim's adoptive father. The police could not overlook the possibility that he himself was the one who had murdered his daughter. Rumors from neighbors and acquaintances described Edward as a man known for his temper and lack of emotional control. He was a highly educated scholar, intelligent, but often lacked restraint in situations. On several occasions, he had displayed excessive anger, sometimes even resorting to violence. Edward had a troubled past. He had been forced to leave his position at a foreign diplomatic office after using a whip to attack locals whom he deemed disobedient. In one incident, he had even broken the nose of a man who dared to harass his daughter in the street, reinforcing the public image of Edward as a quick-tempered and violent man. The big question arose, could a man with such a volatile personality like Edward Werner have lost control in a fit of rage and taken his daughter's life? The police could not dismiss this theory, as Edward's past made him a prime suspect. However, when faced with his daughter's body, Edward was clearly devastated, breaking down at the sight of Pamela. The deep pain and despair on his face were palpable, moving those around him. Moreover, after thoroughly searching Edward's home and examining his clothes, the police found no traces of blood, which gradually weakened the theory that he was the killer. During the investigation, the police arrested several suspects in the hope of finding the culprit behind Pamela's brutal death. However, due to a lack of evidence, none of those arrested were charged, and the case came to a dead end. Ultimately, those suspected had to be released. The investigation gradually stalled, and time passed without any new developments. As the case grew cold, public interest waned. It seemed that people had slowly begun to forget about Pamela's tragic death. Only one person remained haunted by the young girl's murder, Edward Werner, Pamela's adoptive father. While he lived in daily torment, tirelessly seeking justice for his daughter, the London police and government at the time seemed indifferent. They worked in a careless, lethargic manner, showing little urgency in investigating or resolving the case. Edward steadfastly insisted that the person who killed Pamela had to be wealthy enough not to steal her valuable diamond watch. However, his suspicions received little attention from the authorities. Unwilling to give up, Edward offered a substantial reward to anyone who could provide a clue leading to the murderer's capture. Despite submitting multiple requests to the British government to reopen the case for further investigation, all of his efforts were rejected. Each time, his hope was extinguished, but his determination never wavered. Edward decided to continue the investigation on his own. He spared no expense, hiring private detectives in hopes that they might uncover what the police had missed. The man embarked on a challenging journey to seek the truth, knowing full well that it would not be easy. After Edward Werner announced the hefty reward for anyone with information leading to Pamela's killer, countless people came forward. Every day, Edward had to sift through various information, ranging from baseless rumors to vague stories. However, among them, one woman caught his special attention, a prostitute named Marie. Her account provided crucial details and opened up a completely new avenue for investigation. With a haunting gaze, Marie recounted that on the night Pamela was murdered, she had seen a blonde girl, Pamela, arrive in the Badlands, a notorious area known for debauchery, where Marie worked. What stood out was that the girl was not alone, but had appeared with 3 other men. One of them was a name Marie would never forget, Prentice, a wealthy dentist known for indulging in wild behavior, especially when his wife was not around. Marie knew Prentice well. She had been hired, along with other girls, to dance naked and serve the dentist while his wife was away at his private house parties. During those gatherings, Marie had witnessed Prentice proudly showing off his collection of hunting knives. Large, sharp blades displayed all around the room, as if they were his greatest pride. The presence of those knives, along with Prentice's arrogance, always left Marie feeling uneasy. That night, when Pamela arrived with 3 men, Marie could hardly believe the young girl had fallen in with such people. Marie recounted that after they took Pamela down to the first floor, a restricted area, she suddenly heard 2 blood-curdling screams coming from the room. The screams, filled with terror and pain, sent chills down Marie's spine. Then, everything fell silent for a brief moment before a loud thud echoed, like the sound of a body hitting the floor. Marie trembled, believing that in that very moment, Pamela had been murdered. The poor girl had died right there, in the first-floor room, at the hands of Prentice and his accomplices. Marie wasn't the only one haunted by the memories of that night. Another prostitute who had been in the area also confirmed Marie's story. Upon learning this, Edward Werner's resolve only deepened, convinced that if he dug further, the truth would eventually be revealed. Edward continued investigating every possible lead, no matter how small, and eventually, he tracked down the rickshaw puller, a witness the police had previously questioned, but hadn't gotten much information from. The rickshaw puller, with a weary and haunted expression, recounted the events of that night, a chilling detail he had not dared to reveal before. According to the puller, he had seen a blonde girl, none other than Pamela, arrive at a brothel, accompanied by 3 foreign men. Among them was Prentice, whom he later recognized through a photograph, the same dentist Marie and another prostitute had mentioned. In the puller's memory, about 2 hours later, when the night had grown late and the city had quieted down, the group reappeared, carrying the girl, but her condition now terrified him. Pamela's clothes had been torn to shreds, her face covered with a thick cloth, and she was no longer moving. Though the sight made the rickshaw puller deeply uneasy, he dared not ask any questions or intervene, recognizing the danger of the situation. They ordered him to pull the rickshaw to a desolate area on the outskirts of the city. Throughout the journey, the puller couldn't stop thinking about the young blonde girl, now lying motionless. When they arrived, the men paid him. Then suddenly, one of them pulled out a sharp knife and pressed it against his throat, the man threatening that if he uttered a word about what he had seen that night, his life would be in danger. Shaking with fear, the rickshaw puller had no choice but to remain silent. This testimony was the final piece Edward had been searching for, further solidifying his theory that Prentice was the mastermind behind the brutal murder. Pamela's case could not be allowed to fade into oblivion, and despite the dangers he faced, Edward was determined to go to any length to seek justice for his beloved daughter. There was evidence of Prentice and his group hosting depraved sex parties. They would hunt down girls, invite them to these gatherings, and then force them into sexual acts. Afterward, the girls were forced into silence, partly out of fear and partly due to shame. Edward also discovered that on the night Pamela was killed, no movie was being shown at the cinema, even though Prentice had claimed he went to see a film that evening. Once again, Edward petitioned to reopen the case, and once again, the court rejected the grieving father's plea. Piecing the events together, Edward could now clearly see what had happened. In reality, Prentice had set his sights on Pamela ever since he treated her teeth. Afterward, he invited Pamela to a party. Trusting the dentist as a good person, she accepted the invitation. After leaving the first party, the group took her to a brothel. There, the young girl was overpowered by 3 men. She was a very strong person, but this time she was helpless. They held her arms and legs tightly and struck her hard on the head with a blunt object. She collapsed to the ground. Just 3 minutes later, she died in that filthy brothel. At that moment, the criminals panicked as they realized they were left with her lifeless body. They knew they had to dispose of the corpse, making sure no one could identify it and leaving no trace of the culprits behind. Despite Edward Werner's tireless efforts to bring Pamela's case to light, the horrifying truth remained concealed. The case gradually faded into obscurity, not due to a lack of evidence, but because of unseen hands controlling everything behind the scenes. The police, either out of laziness or worse, having been bribed, showed little interest in conducting a thorough investigation. They turned a blind eye to the clear evidence that Edward had painstakingly gathered. Over 150 pages of documents Edward meticulously compiled, including crucial evidence, witness testimonies, and his sharp theories were heartlessly dismissed. Werner's grief over the loss of his daughter was compounded by a deep sense of helplessness. He had done everything he could, but the powerful system, and the indifference of those in authority, ensured that Pamela's case would forever remain an unsolved mystery. Case 2. Pastor Elijah King, 42, was the embodiment of devotion in his Florida community. Known for his fiery sermons on faith, family, and moral values, Elijah's ministry drew hundreds of followers who saw him as a beacon of righteousness. His dedication to his church and his family earned him admiration, with many viewing him as the living example of the virtues he preached. Naomi King, 38, was the perfect counterpart to Elijah. Graceful and composed, she balanced her roles as a preacher's wife and the dedicated mother of their 5 children, Abigail, 16, Elijah Jr., 14, Noah, 12, Sophie, 9, and Micah, 6. Naomi's presence in the community was constant, leading Sunday school, organizing charity drives, and supporting Elijah's ministry at every step. Together, they presented the image of a family blessed by faith, living a life others could only aspire to. At the heart of their spiritual foundation was Deacon Henry King, Elijah's 65-year-old father. A respected elder in the church, Henry had spent decades serving as a deacon and a moral compass for the congregation. His influence on Elijah's upbringing was profound. From a young age, Henry had instilled in his son a deep reverence for God, a commitment to family, and an unwavering adherence to Scripture. Elijah often credited his father during sermons, praising him as the rock upon which their family had been built. The King household was vibrant with activity. Abigail, 16, was thoughtful and academically driven, often helping with church youth programs. Elijah Jr., 14, was reserved but attentive, always eager to lend a hand during church services. Noah, 12, was the family's curious and playful spirit, while Sophie, 9, was known for her sensitivity and eagerness to please. The youngest, Micah, 6, was the light of the family, doted on by everyone and blissfully unaware of life's complexities. Sunday dinners at Henry's home were a cherished family tradition. These gatherings often began with scripture readings and heartfelt prayers led by Henry himself, followed by lively discussions about the church and community. For Elijah, these moments were a source of pride, a symbol of the strong bond that connected the King family and their shared dedication to their faith. One evening at dinner, the King family sat gathered around their oak dining table, enjoying a rare moment of laughter and togetherness. Abigail, their eldest at 16, spoke up with excitement in her voice. For my genealogy project at school, I thought it'd be fun if we all did a DNA test. We can find out about our ancestry, maybe even find distant relatives. Her younger siblings EJ, 14, Noah, 12, Sophie, 9, and Micah, 6 buzzed with excitement, chiming in with their guesses about hidden royal bloodlines or mysterious family origins. Elijah, always supportive of his children's pursuits, smiled warmly. That sounds like a great idea. It'll be something we can all do together. Across the table, Naomi's smile faltered. She reached for a glass of water, her fingers trembling slightly. I don't know, Abby, she said softly. These things aren't always accurate, and they can be invasive. Her voice trailed off as she glanced at Henry, who was seated at the head of the table, his usual stern expression unchanging. Come on, Naomi, Elijah said, brushing off her hesitation. What's the harm? It's just a fun family activity, and it'll be good for Abigail's project. He reached over and placed his hand over hers, offering her a reassuring smile. We've got nothing to hide. Naomi looked at him for a moment, her expression unreadable, before nodding slowly. All right, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The children cheered as Elijah pulled out his phone to order the DNA kits. Henry gave a tight smile but said nothing, sipping his coffee in silence. A few weeks later, the results arrived. Abigail eagerly gathered everyone around the computer as Elijah logged into the website. The room buzzed with excitement as they explored the report's ancestral origins, historical connections, and distant relatives. But as Elijah scrolled through the results, his brow furrowed. Something didn't add up. Wait, he said, leaning closer to the screen. This says I'm not a match to any of the kids as their biological father. He laughed nervously, shaking his head. That's obviously a mistake. Probably some kind of database error. Naomi froze, her hand tightening around the edge of the chair. Henry's gaze flicked to Elijah, his face calm but his jaw visibly clenched. I'll reach out to the company, Elijah said, his voice firm but composed. They probably just mixed up the data. He stood from the table and kissed Naomi on the top of her head. Don't worry about it. I'll get it sorted out. Over the next few days, Elijah contacted the genealogy company, pointing out the error in their report. He explained the issue in detail, confident they'd come back with a correction. But when their response arrived, it left him reeling. We've triple-checked the results, the company representative explained over the phone. There's no mistake. The children's biological father is someone other than you, and the markers match another close relative within your submitted samples. Elijah's heart sank. He asked them to confirm again, but the answer remained the same. Hanging up the phone, he sat in stunned silence. The only possible match within the submitted samples was his father, Henry. The weight of the revelation crushed him. His mind raced back to subtle moments, Henry's frequent visits, the way Naomi had grown quiet whenever he was around, her initial resistance to the DNA test. It all began to make horrifying sense. That evening, Elijah returned home, clutching the printed DNA results. Naomi was in the living room, folding laundry. He threw the papers onto the table, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. Explain this, he demanded, his voice cold and sharp. Naomi's eyes darted to the papers, then to Elijah. What are you talking about? She asked, her voice trembling. The DNA results, Elijah snapped. They're saying I'm not the father of my children. But they also say there's another match in our family. Care to explain that? Naomi's face paled as she clutched the back of the chair for support. There must be a mistake, she stammered. That can't be right. Elijah leaned closer, his voice rising. Don't lie to me, Naomi. I went back to the company. They verified it, there's no mistake. So, I'll ask you again. Explain this. Naomi broke down, tears streaming down her face as she sank into the chair. Through sobs, she confessed to a dark secret she had kept buried for years. Early in their marriage, Henry had coerced her into a sexual relationship. His influence and authority made her feel powerless to resist, and the abuse had continued for years. All 5 of them, Naomi whispered, her voice breaking. They're all his. I didn't know how to stop it. I didn't want to destroy you, Elijah. Elijah staggered back, the room spinning around him. The woman he loved, the father he revered, they had shattered his life in the most personal and devastating way imaginable. He stormed out of the house, his mind a storm of rage, betrayal, and disbelief. Elijah King sat alone in his car that night, the weight of Naomi's confession pressing down on him like a physical force. His mind raced, each thought darker and more chaotic than the last. The life he had built, his faith, his family, his ministry, had been a lie. His children, his pride and joy, were not his. His wife, the woman he had trusted above all, had been trapped in a horrifying secret. And his father, the man who had raised him, guided him, and taught him to live by God's word, was a monster. The emotions came in waves: shock, pain, disbelief, then anger so blinding it took his breath away. Elijah gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. Tears streamed down his face as he shouted into the empty car. Why? How could they do this to me? He slammed his fists against the dashboard, the frustration boiling over. He drove aimlessly for hours, the streets of his quiet Florida town empty under the moonlight. Memories of family dinners, sermons about forgiveness, and the moments he thought defined his perfect life flooded his mind, now tinged with betrayal. Everywhere he turned in his thoughts, he was met with lies. As dawn broke, Elijah found himself parked at the edge of a lake, staring out at the water. In the stillness of the morning, his pain began to transform into something colder, sharper: vengeance. The betrayal was too great to forgive, the wounds too deep to heal. In his mind, there was only one way to bring justice to the situation. His father and his wife needed to pay for what they had done. Elijah began to plan, the clarity of his thoughts startling him. He had spent years preaching forgiveness, but forgiveness was no longer an option. His heart, once full of compassion, now burned with the need for retribution. He replayed Naomi's confession over and over, each word fueling his resolve. When Elijah returned home, he was calm, eerily so. He didn't speak much to Naomi, who had spent the night crying in their bedroom. He couldn't look at his children without feeling a sharp pang of grief, knowing they weren't his, but he still loved them fiercely. That love only deepened his anger. The evening was heavy with tension as Elijah returned home. Naomi sat alone in the living room, her tear-streaked face pale and anxious. She had spent the entire day on edge, dreading the inevitable confrontation. Elijah entered the room silently, his eyes dark and emotionless, a kitchen knife concealed in his grip. Naomi looked up, her face contorting with a mixture of fear and hope. "Elijah," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I know you're hurt, but we don't," he interrupted, his voice low and icy. "Don't you dare try to fix this with words. You've destroyed everything, Naomi. Everything." Naomi stood, wringing her hands as tears began streaming down her face. "I was trapped, Elijah. I didn't know how to stop it. I never wanted to hurt you." Elijah's laugh was sharp and bitter, cutting through her words like the knife he gripped. "You didn't want to hurt me. You let him violate our marriage, father my children, and sit at our table as if nothing was wrong. You lied to me every single day, Naomi." She fell to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. "Please, Elijah, I love you. I love you. We can fix this, fix this." Elijah snapped, his rage finally erupting. "This can't be fixed. You've condemned me to live a lie, and now you'll pay for it." With a sudden, savage movement, he plunged the knife into her chest. Naomi gasped, her eyes wide with shock as the blade tore through her body. Elijah's face was devoid of mercy as he pulled the knife out and struck again, this time in her abdomen. The room was filled with the sickening sound of flesh tearing and her anguished cries. Naomi tried to crawl away, her blood pooling on the floor, but Elijah was relentless. Each stab was fueled by years of betrayal and humiliation. "You should have told me the truth," he shouted, his voice shaking with rage. "You should have stopped him." When Naomi finally lay still, her body a lifeless heap on the blood-soaked carpet, Elijah stepped back, panting heavily. The rage inside him didn't subside, it only shifted focus. There was still one more person who needed to face justice. The evening air was heavy as Elijah drove to Henry's house, his grip tight on the steering wheel. His mind raced with thoughts of betrayal and vengeance. The image of his lifeless wife burned into his memory. He had nothing left to lose, and justice, in his eyes, demanded blood. Bursting through the door, Elijah found Henry sitting at the dining table, a cup of tea in hand, and his Bible open in front of him. Startled, Henry looked up. "Elijah, what are you doing here?" he asked, his voice tinged with confusion and a flicker of fear. Elijah didn't respond. Instead, he threw the crumpled DNA results onto the table. "Explain this," he demanded, his voice low and simmering with rage. Henry's eyes darted to the paper and then back to Elijah. "I don't know what this is," he said, his voice faltering. "Don't you dare lie to me," Elijah snapped, his hands trembling. "You've been violating Naomi for years, haven't you? You fathered my children." Henry stood, raising his hands as though to calm his son. "Elijah, listen to me. It's not what you think, don't lie." Elijah roared, his voice shaking the room. "You destroyed my family. You're a monster." Before Henry could speak again, Elijah lunged forward, plunging the knife into his father's side. Henry cried out, stumbling backward and clutching at the wound. Blood seeped through his shirt as he tried to steady himself, but Elijah didn't stop. With savage precision, Elijah stabbed him again and again, each thrust driven by years of pent-up rage. Henry collapsed to the floor, writhing in pain, his strength draining rapidly. "You deserve to feel the pain you inflicted on me," Elijah growled, standing over his father. Henry tried to crawl away, his breaths coming in short, desperate gasps, but his body was too weak to respond. Elijah knelt beside him, his voice cold and steady. "This is for Naomi. This is for the years of lies. This is for my children." Gripping the knife tightly, Elijah began the gruesome act of cutting off Henry's manhood. Henry's screams of agony filled the room, his body convulsing as blood pooled beneath him. Elijah's expression was stone cold, his focus unwavering as he carried out his grotesque retribution. The pain proved too much for Henry. His screams weakened, his body trembling violently before going limp. He exhaled one final, ragged breath and then was silent. Elijah dropped the knife, now slick with blood, and stumbled back, his chest heaving. The room reeked of iron and death, the echoes of Henry's torment still ringing in his ears. For a moment, he stood there, staring at the lifeless body of the man he had once called his father. But there was no relief, no satisfaction, only a hollow emptiness where his faith and family had once been. Elijah walked out of the house, his clothes soaked in blood. Then he sat on the front porch. The quiet neighborhood erupted in chaos when police arrived at Henry's house, responding to frantic calls from neighbors who had heard horrifying screams and crashing noises. The officers, weapons drawn, approached cautiously, expecting resistance. Instead, they found Elijah sitting on Henry's front porch, drenched in blood, his Bible resting in his lap. Elijah's demeanor was chillingly calm. He looked up at the officers as they approached, his expression unreadable. "It's done," he said simply, raising his hands in surrender. "God's justice has been served." The officers quickly handcuffed him, their unease palpable. As Elijah was led to the patrol car, one officer cautiously ventured inside the house. What they discovered was beyond words, a scene of unimaginable violence. Henry's body lay in a grotesque state, his chest riddled with stabbed wounds and his manhood cruelly severed. The pool of blood and the signs of struggle spoke volumes about the brutality of the act. As they placed Elijah into the back seat of the car, he turned to one of the officers. His voice was steady, almost casual. "Naomi," he said, "you'll find her at our house. She betrayed me too." The officers exchanged shocked glances, realizing the full scale of the horrors they were dealing with. Rushing to Elijah's home, they found Naomi exactly as Elijah had described. Her dismembered body lay in the living room, her remains scattered in a gruesome display of rage and methodical violence. Back at the station, Elijah provided a chillingly detailed confession, his voice devoid of emotion. "She lied to me for years," he said of Naomi. "And my father, he ruined everything I believed in. They had to face the consequences." His calm recounting of the murders stunned the investigators. When pressed on his actions, Elijah simply replied, "They destroyed our family. I just finished what they started." The dual crime scenes, the sheer brutality of the murders, Elijah's cold composure sent shockwaves through the community. Their once revered preacher had become a figure of terror, leaving a devastating legacy of violence and betrayal in his wake. Elijah's trial drew national attention, a horrifying tale of betrayal, rage, and gruesome vengeance that captivated the public. The courtroom was packed with journalists, onlookers, and members of Elijah's former congregation, all eager to see how the justice system would handle the preacher-turned-murderer. The defense painted Elijah as a man driven to madness by unimaginable betrayal. They called on psychologists to testify about the trauma he endured upon learning the truth about his children's parentage and his father's abuse of Naomi. They described his actions as those of a man pushed past the limits of human endurance. The prosecution, however, focused on the premeditated and brutal nature of the murders, particularly the gruesome mutilation of his father. Prosecutors argued that while the betrayal he suffered was extreme, it could not justify the sheer violence of his actions. The jury deliberated for several days, weighing the horrific circumstances against the brutality of Elijah's crimes. In the end, they returned with a verdict of guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. The judge, acknowledging the complexity of the case but bound by the law, sentenced Elijah to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Elijah's children, now orphans, were separated and placed in foster care, each struggling to come to terms with the horrific truths about their family. The once-admired King family became a haunting cautionary tale, a stark reminder of how hidden secrets and betrayal can tear even the most devout lives apart. As Elijah was led out of the courtroom in shackles, He carried his Bible tightly in hand, muttering prayers to a God he believed had guided his actions. To the public, he became a symbol of the destructive power of secrets and rage, a tragic figure who lost everything in his quest for justice. Elijah King's descent from a pillar of faith to a figure of horror serves as a chilling testament to the destructive power of secrets and betrayal. This tale reminds us that even the most revered individuals are not immune to the chaos hidden truths can unleash. Case 3. In 2012, at the Summer Olympics in London, the star of a young Puerto Rican boxer, Felix Verdejo Sanchez, shone brightly. He was called a diamond, one of the most promising athletes of his country. He was predicted to win titles and gold medals. Then it seemed to everyone that this talented and motivated young man will reach fantastic heights in sports. In 2021, the name of the boxer again traveled all the world's media, but this time fell into the section of criminal chronicles. This story is about a teenage attachment that grew into a kind of addiction and led to a terrible tragedy, and also about how the author of the main knockout of 2014, who was praised and promoted by two-time Olympic champion Vasyl Lomachenko, almost received a death sentence, but eventually went to prison for life. It is noteworthy that despite the presence of irrefutable evidence and confessions of the boxer's accomplice, he himself to this day refuses to plead guilty. The future star of world boxing was born in the Puerto Rican city of San Juan in 1993 on May 19th. He grew up in a rather modest large family, and from an early age was fond of port. True, in childhood he planned to connect his life with baseball, but his further fate was determined by a funny incident. When the boy was 9 years old, a family friend came to visit them with his son of the same age. The boys were playing in the yard, but suddenly quarreled and a fight broke out. Parents separated the children, and the father of the future athlete noted that if he wants to fight with someone in the future, let him wear boxing gloves. After that fight, Felix, at his request, was taken to a local gym, where the boy, as he later admitted himself, from the first training session fell in love with boxing. At the age of 16, he won the Pan American Junior Championships. A year later, he won his country's championship, and a year later, he went to the Olympic Games in London, where he reached the quarterfinals. In the same year began his brilliant career in the professional ring. In total, Verdejo had 29 fights, gaining 27 confident victories, and in 2014 he was recognized as the author of the best knockout in the fight against Sergio Villanueva. A year later, Felix won his first championship belt with the WBO Latino title, which he subsequently defended 6 more times in 2 years. Everyone who saw him in the fight had no doubt this young man will write his name in the history of world boxing. And now let's get to know Keishla Rodriguez. The girl was born in November 1993 in San Juan. The full name given to her at birth is Keishla Marlene Rodriguez Ortiz. Her parents, Jose and Kayla Rodriguez, had another common daughter, Beryl Nicole, and also the couple raised Kayla's son, Jonathan, from a previous marriage of a woman. Keishla grew up an open and sociable girl. She did well in school and adored animals, dreaming of becoming a veterinarian in the future. Her best friend was her sister Beryl, to whom she confided all her secrets and worries. Keishla studied in the same school with Felix Verdejo, who was her age. Young people were acquainted since childhood, and in adolescence between them began a romantic relationship. In 2011, Rodriguez's parents divorced and separated. Kayla moved to relatives in Florida, and her daughters, who were by then already adults, decided to stay in San Juan. Despite the fact that each of the sisters had long since lived their own lives, they continued to stay in close contact and told each other about everything that was happening to them. At the age of 18, a promising boxer, who has already managed to take part in the Olympic Games, had an affair with a young schoolgirl and aspiring model, Elisa Maria Santiago Sierra. At that time, the girl was only 14 years old, and she was still in school, but even then she made big plans for the future with a promising and world-famous athlete. In addition, Elisa's parents were not at all against this relationship. Attractive and talented Felix, who has always had a lot of fans, becoming a boxing star, literally bathed in the rays of fame, and was surrounded by female attention. He did not miss the opportunity to spin a novel or a passing affair on the side, and also, despite the serious relationship with Elisa, continued to meet with his school friend Keishla. Keishla's sister, Berylis, and her mother, Kayla Rodriguez, knew about the affair and did not approve of the relationship. In addition, the situation was very ambiguous. On the one hand, Elisa considered herself the only woman in great love of the athlete, was preparing for the wedding, and made far-reaching plans for their joint future. On the other hand, Kishla knew that the lover has a fiancé, but at the same time, Felix did not let her go. On top of that, he was her first great love, and deep down, the naive girl herself still hoped to be the one. In 2016, the boxer did marry the young Elisa, who at that time was barely 19 years old. Elisa by that time was already quite a famous model, had tens of thousands of followers in social networks, and also opened her own beauty studio for eyelash extensions. In August of the same year, just a few months after the wedding, the athlete got into a serious car accident when he was rushing on his motorcycle. He was taken to the hospital in serious condition with head injuries, bruises, and lacerations. His trainer, Ricky Marquez, seriously feared that his talented charge would go off the rails at the height of his career, but Felix, contrary to the disappointing prognosis, made a rapid recovery and soon returned to the ring. In September 2019, the boxer published in his profile in the social network a picture with Elisa, who was in a large term of pregnancy. In the comment to the photo, he wrote, "Soon I will meet my daddy's princess." And a month later, he announced the birth of a daughter, who was given the name Miranda Verdejo Santiago. The young man in public looked like a loving husband, caring father, and an exemplary family man, but secretly from his wife he continued to meet with Kishla, who could not let go. As Elisa later admitted, she guessed that her husband was cheating on her, but every time he tearfully vowed to leave his mistress. Kishla repeatedly tried to break off this painful relationship, but Felix would not let her go. She had no other men, because the boxer threatened that if he found out about the fact that Kishla had someone not good for her and her chosen one, Kishla herself, who had fallen in love with Verdejo since high school, continued to love him despite everything. Rodriguez, as planned, connected her life with the care of animals and got a job at the Center of Veterinary Medicine and Aesthetics. Colleagues described her as conscientious, hardworking, and very responsible. She lived with 2 dogs and a cat, which she simply adored. In 2020, Elisa discovered the correspondence of her husband with several mistresses, including Kishla. The wife gave her husband a scandal and threw him out of the house, threatening that she would file for divorce and forbid him to see his daughter. Elisa's threats had an effect. In addition, in the career of the athlete at that time, there was a serious decline and unnecessary problems where he did not need. For a while, he really stopped seeing Rodriguez, but Felix still did not let her go, trying to control almost every step Kishla. After a few months of secret visits resumed, and in April 2021, Kishla discovered that she was pregnant. She bought a rapid test at the drugstore, which only confirmed her fears. She first called her sister, who was aware of her complicated relationship with the athlete, and told her everything. It was out of the question to have abortion, because Kishla was already 27 years old, and she was ready to have a child, even if she had to raise it on her own. A few days later, Kishla broke the news to the father of her child, hoping in her heart that he would accept it. But Felix was not happy, to put it mildly. He got angry and told his mistress that she should go to the doctor, and if the pregnancy is confirmed, it will be necessary to have an abortion. Naturally, Rodriguez answered him with a firm refusal, but the boxer began to threaten her and insist. Felix said that an illegitimate child will finally destroy his reputation, and this he cannot allow. After Kishla's visit to the hospital, her pregnancy was confirmed, and she now had a certificate to prove it. She called Felix and told him everything, which made him furious. Felix shouted and demanded that Kishla immediately get rid of the child, but she again responded with a categorical refusal. Then the athlete decided to go on the sly, saying that he did not believe her, and wanted to personally look at the issued medical certificate. He appointed Kishla a meeting in the evening in a crowded place, which did not surprise her, because they always tried not to draw attention to themselves and do not get in front of anyone. A few days before the meeting, the boxer stopped by his old friend Luis Antonio Cadiz, who worked in a local machine shop and also had ties with the criminal world, selling illegal drugs. Felix briefly outlined the situation and asked him to help him get rid of his pregnant mistress. Luis had previously been in the field of vision of the police, and the prospect of being in prison scared him, but the athlete was persistent, assured that everything would go smoothly and the police will never come out on them. Besides, Felix promised him an impressive cash reward, and Luis agreed. With the support of an accomplice, Felix called Kishla and told her that he wanted to meet her on the evening of April 29th to confirm her pregnancy and decide what to do next. Immediately after talking to her lover, Kishla called her sister back and told her everything. She still had hope that Felix would accept her child and would not insist on an abortion. But Bereliz saw this situation as quite alarmed. She knew that the boyfriend had threatened her sister, and she was worried that he wouldn't do anything to her. Bereliz called her mother and shared her concerns, but even together they could not dissuade Kishla from that fateful meeting. At the appointed time, Rodriguez, taking a doctor's note, arrived at the meeting in her own Kia Forte automobile. Verdejo drove there in his pickup truck, in the back of which Luis was hiding. Kishla immediately got into the athlete's car and showed him the results of the tests. He once again talked about terminating the pregnancy, but Kishla, crying, again responded with a refusal. Against this background, the couple began to quarrel violently, turning to shouting. Then Felix suddenly hit Kishla in the head with his fist, from which she immediately lost consciousness. Until Kishla regained consciousness, Felix took a syringe with a large dose of illegal substances hidden in the glove compartment of the car, which Luis had obtained at his request, and injected Kishla. Then, together with his accomplice, they carried her to the back of the car, where there were already prepared pieces of wire and a concrete block. The men tied Rodriguez up, attached the load, and then covered her with a tarp so that no one would accidentally see anything. Felix then returned to the pickup truck while his accomplice got behind the wheel of Kishla's vehicle. Together, they drove to the bridge over the San Jose Lagoon. It was virtually deserted at night, and the men, making sure no one could see them, threw Kishla, still alive, into the water. Afterward, however, they decided to fire a few test shots in pursuit, using the firearms they had brought with them, so as not to leave the victim any chance. Having finished the massacre, each of the perpetrators went home. Kishla's co-workers were the first to worry when she didn't show up at the Veterinary Medicine and Aesthetics Center the next day. Kishla has always been very responsible, and couldn't just not show up for work without notifying anyone. Since she didn't answer the phone, it was decided to contact her sister to find out what happened. After several unsuccessful attempts to contact her sister, she went to her house. No one answered the door, but Bereliz had a spare key, so she got in without difficulty. However, she was met only by hungry animals who had not eaten anything for almost 24 hours. Now Bereliz was already in a panic, because she realized that something terrible or irreparable had happened to Kishla. She immediately called her mother and told her everything, and then reported to the police about her suspicions and threats to her sister. She also called Felix, but he claimed that he had spent the previous evening and night at home with his family, and had not gone to any meeting. The missing girl's mother took the first flight from Florida to San Juan. She thought that her lover might have taken her daughter to a private clinic and paid for her to have an abortion without her consent. Kayla didn't even want to think about the fact that Kishla was no longer alive. The first thing to do was to question the co-workers, but they didn't notice anything suspicious and couldn't provide the investigation with any useful information. In parallel, messages about the disappearance of Rodriguez were posted on popular social networks with requests to respond to those who know anything about her fate or current whereabouts. The case quickly received wide publicity, and when it became known that the missing girl was in a long-term relationship with a famous athlete and was expecting a child from him, reporters literally lined up to interview any of Rodriguez's family members. The relatives did not hold anything back and spoke out about their suspicions, among other things, blaming Felix for the incident. On April 30th, Kishla's car was found abandoned on the east side of the city, with her documents and personal belongings inside. No signs of struggle were found in the interior, giving a faint hope of finding its owner alive. On May 1st, a passerby strolling on the bridge over the lagoon saw a strange shape resembling a human body in the shallow water. He reported his discovery to the police, who soon recovered from the water the body of a young woman, presumably the same one the whole city had been looking for several days. Members of the Rodriguez family who arrived to identify the body hoped to the last that it was not Kishla, but their hopes were not realized. The body had been in the water for several days and changed a lot, but the girl was immediately identified by a remarkable tattoo on her arm. When news of the gruesome discovery hit the press, the residents of the city revolted and began to go out to spontaneous rallies, demanding punishment for those responsible. The same day, Verdejo was detained and taken to the police station for questioning, but the athlete categorically denied his involvement and claimed that on the night of Kishla's disappearance, he was at home with his family. As there was nothing to charge him, Felix was released on his own recognizance. One of the key witnesses was the athlete's legal wife, who at the first interrogation admitted that she was aware of his affair with Kishla, but that she had heard about her rival's pregnancy for the first time. On top of that, she did not confirm her husband's alibi, saying that he was not at home on the night of the murder. The first thing investigators did was check traffic surveillance footage on the way to the bridge from which Kishla was thrown. That's how they found Felix's pickup truck and the victim's car traveling behind each other. But the Kia Forte was clearly not driven by its owner. On the same day, the boxer's car was seized for examination, and in its body they found some hair of the deceased. Luis was the first to surrender to the police, promising to tell the whole truth in exchange for a reduced sentence. Felix was also taken into custody, but he refused to cooperate with the investigation, did not answer questions, and continued to deny his guilt, despite the presence of irrefutable evidence. A firearm was seized from Felix, which he used to shoot the victim from the bridge, and for which he had an official permit. Also, a cell phone check confirmed the fact that Felix, Luis, and Kishla were in the location on that fateful night. Kishla's final farewell was on May 8th, and the funeral ceremony was all over the national news. It was a kind of action, calling for the perpetrators of the tragedy to be punished to the full extent of the law, as well as an action to draw public attention to the problem of gender violence. The coffin with Rodriguez's body was brought to the cemetery, not in a traditional hearse, but in a white carriage, over which white flower petals were thrown from the air. Many famous Puerto Rican natives, including show business stars, athletes, politicians, and public figures, have spoken out about the high-profile incident. Verdejo was charged with carjacking, kidnapping, premeditated murder, and the murder of an unborn child. All of these crimes together carried the death penalty, but the relatives of the deceased from the very beginning asked the court to elect a sentence of life imprisonment for the killer, so that he would suffer in captivity for the rest of his life. The hearing was repeatedly postponed due to the worldwide coronavirus pandemic, but in the spring of 2021, the trial was held in virtual mode. The court found that the crime was committed by a group of persons by prior conspiracy, and with particular cruelty against a pregnant woman. It was possible to reconstruct the chain of events of that night, and the details of the crime, mainly thanks to the testimony of Luis, who did not deny his guilt. He admitted that it was he who, at the request of a friend, got the drug for injection, and also brought a wire and a concrete block to get rid of the body. But Felix continued to insist on his non-involvement in the case, although his words could not seriously affect the situation. By the way, the wife of the boxer, who acted in court as a witness, almost immediately after the arrest of her husband filed for divorce, and tried to abstract from what was happening, focusing on the development of his business and raising a young daughter. According to some reports, not so long ago, Elisa Santiago remarried. Elisa herself admitted in an interview that she repeatedly received anonymous calls and messages with death threats, as well as death wishes to her and even Miranda. Many considered it was the spouse of the athlete as the organizer of the crime, but no evidence was found. In the summer of 2023, it became known that the jury, having familiarized itself with all the evidence and heard the testimony of all the witnesses, was finally ready to announce the final verdict. Felix Verdejo and his accomplice Luis Cadiz were found guilty on each of the charges against them, but despite this, the killers have not yet been sentenced. The next court hearing is scheduled for mid-November 2023. Most likely, both men involved in the deaths of Kishla Rodriguez and her unborn child will likely go to prison for life, with no right to ever leave prison. Case 4. Jerome Henry Brudos was born on January 31st, 1939, in the small town of Webster, South Dakota. From the very beginning, his life was marked by hardship. As the second-born son, his arrival deeply disappointed his mother, who had longed for a daughter. This resentment shaped his childhood as he endured relentless physical and emotional abuse at her hands. Affection was something he never knew. No kind words, no comforting embrace, only harsh beatings and relentless scoldings. Throughout his early years, the Brudos family moved frequently across the Pacific Northwest, never settling in one place for too long. Eventually, they made their home in Salem, Oregon. By then, Jerry was a deeply unhappy child, carrying the weight of neglect and cruelty. Yet, in the midst of his misery, he stumbled upon something that finally gave his life meaning. One day, while exploring a local junkyard, he came across a pair of high-heeled shoes. Mesmerized, he took them home and, once alone in his room, slipped them on. The way they felt excited him, but his moment of curiosity was abruptly shattered when his mother caught him. Furious, she ripped the shoes away and punished him severely. However, rather than discouraging him, this experience only deepened his obsession. As he grew older, his fixation expanded beyond shoes to include women's lingerie. He began stealing undergarments from neighbors, carefully hiding his trophies. By the age of 12, his compulsions escalated. He stole high heels from his teacher and undergarments from his classmates. His actions were alarming enough that he was sent to therapy and even admitted to psychiatric hospitals. Yet, nothing seemed to change his behavior. Adolescence only intensified his impulses. He started targeting women, attacking them by choking them into unconsciousness before fleeing with their shoes. The stolen garments became objects of fixation, fueling his fantasies of control and domination. At 16, he took his obsessions a step further. He abducted a young girl, physically assaulted her, and threatened her with a knife. His attack was interrupted by an elderly couple who happened to pass by, leading to his arrest. Once in custody, he confessed without hesitation. Psychiatric evaluations revealed a deep-seated hatred for women, particularly his mother, stemming from years of mistreatment. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia, though doctors believed his behavior was rooted more in immaturity than true danger. Convinced that he would simply outgrow his disturbing tendencies, they released him after 9 months. Upon reaching adulthood, Jerry attempted to integrate into society by enlisting in the military, but his unusual obsessions led to his discharge. Shifting paths, he trained as an electronics technician. In 1961, at 22 years old, he met Darcy, a 17-year-old girl, and quickly fell in love. They married soon after and had 2 children. However, Jerry proved to be as cold and violent toward his children as his mother had been toward him. Affection was non-existent, and discipline came through force. With his wife, however, he was intensely passionate, yet his desires took on an unsettling form. He confided in Darcy about his fantasies, insisting that she perform household chores while wearing nothing but high heels. He also demanded to photograph her in provocative poses. Though she felt uncomfortable, she feared confronting him. One evening, he approached her wearing women's lingerie. Shocked by her reaction, he seemed hurt, as if expecting her to understand. Over time, Darcy discovered his growing collection of photographs of women. Though she was disturbed, she let it pass. Eventually, she refused to be intimate with him. By the mid-1960s, Jerry began experiencing severe headaches and frequent blackouts. He insisted that the only way to relieve his symptoms was to go on nocturnal raids, where he would break into homes and steal women's shoes and lingerie. These stolen items were his treasures, carefully hidden in his garage, a place he guarded fiercely. To ensure no one disturbed his secret world, he installed an intercom system that alerted him if anyone approached. After years of theft and obsession, in 1968, Jerry decided to take his fantasies to a far darker level. 19-year-old Linda Slauson was a door-to-door saleswoman working hard to save money for college. On January 26, 1968, her sales route took her to a quiet neighborhood in Portland, Oregon. When she knocked on Garen's door, he was immediately drawn to her. His most sinister urges awakened. He lured her inside with lies, despite the fact that his wife and children were home, eating lunch. Once she stepped inside, he struck her hard, knocking her unconscious before dragging her silently into the garage. Not a single member of his family heard a sound. Inside his private lair, he strangled Linda to death. Afterward, he carefully undressed her, replacing her clothing with items from his collection. He then slipped high heels onto her lifeless feet and posed her for a series of photographs, preserving the moment forever. After committing his first murder, Jerry realized he couldn't keep Linda's body hidden in his garage forever. Determined to preserve a piece of his crime, he used a hacksaw to remove her left foot, placing it in a freezer. His intention was grotesque. He planned to use it as a model to shape the high-heeled shoes he had been collecting. The rest of her remains were disposed of a river, tied to a car engine before being pushed off a bridge. When he returned home, he fixated on the severed foot, slipping different pairs of heels onto it and taking photographs. It became his most treasured trophy. Meanwhile, Linda's disappearance went unnoticed for weeks. Her family reported her missing, but the publishing company she worked for had no record of the homes she had visited that day. Tracking her movements was impossible. Eventually, the police found her abandoned car, but there were no signs of a struggle, no missing belongings, nothing to indicate foul play. If she had been abducted, the perpetrator had been meticulous. With no leads, investigators moved on, and the case faded into obscurity. Jerry, however, was elated. He had committed what he believed to be the perfect crime. But the satisfaction didn't last. His hunger for violence only grew stronger. Over the following months, he perfected his method, striking again and again. On November 26, 1968, 23-year-old Jan Whitney was traveling home for Thanksgiving when her car broke down between Salem and Albany. The breakdown created the perfect opportunity for Jerry to appear as a helpful stranger. He offered her a ride so she could call for a tow truck, and she accepted, seeing no reason to be wary. But as they drove, he suddenly attacked her with a leather strap before subjecting her to further abuse. Afterward, he suspended her body in his garage, leaving it hanging from a pulley for several days. During that time, he dressed her, photographed her, and assaulted her again. Taking his depravity even further, he amputated one of her breasts and created a resin mold, turning it into a grotesque paperweight. When he was finally done, he tied her body to a heavy metal object and dumped it in a river. A few days later, police discovered Jan's car abandoned by the roadside near Albany, exactly where it had broken down. The car was locked, and authorities theorized that she may have sought help from a passing driver. Like Linda before her, Jan simply vanished. There were no clues, no witnesses, and no leads. Jerry remained untouchable, and his thirst for blood only intensified. On March 27, 1969, 18-year-old Karen Sprinker parked her car outside a department store, unaware that she was moments away from a nightmare. As she stepped out, Jerry, this time disguised in women's clothing, appeared and forced her into his vehicle at gunpoint. He drove her straight to his garage, where he once again carried out his horrific ritual. He forced her to model his collection of lingerie, photographing her in disturbing poses before strangling her with the garage pulley. Even in death, his cruelty continued. He mutilated her body, removing her breasts to create additional resin molds. Finally, as he had done before, he weighed down the remains and discarded them in a river. That afternoon, Karen's mother waited for her at a downtown restaurant, excited to reunite with her daughter after months apart. But Karen never arrived. After waiting over an hour, her mother grew anxious and called the police. Investigators quickly located her car in the department store's parking garage, her keys and belongings still inside. Witnesses reported seeing a tall, odd-looking woman in the area that day, but one person claimed to have realized that this woman was actually a man in disguise. Though it was an unusual detail at the time, authorities had no reason to connect it to Karen's disappearance. Less than a month later, on April 21, 1969, 24-year-old Sharon would left her job in Portland to meet her ex-husband and discuss their divorce. As she reached her car in an underground parking lot, she suddenly felt something hard press against her back. A voice ordered her not to scream. Turning around, she saw a tall, freckled man pointing a gun at her. It was Jerry, hunting for his next victim. Sharon had no intention of becoming another statistic. She fought back with all her strength. In the struggle, she managed to bite his hand, drawing blood, and tried to wrestle the gun from him. Enraged, he slammed her head against the concrete, momentarily stunning her. But before he could finish what he had started, he heard footsteps approaching. Panicked, he fled, leaving Sharon battered but alive. A witness called the police, and Sharon gave them a detailed description of her attacker, a tall man with blue eyes and freckles. But when investigators searched the area, no one matching that description could be found. The very next day, on April 22nd, he attempted to abduct 15-year-old Gloria Smith in Salem. He tried to force her into his car, but she managed to escape and report the incident. Like Sharon, she described a large, freckled man driving a sports car. Investigators noted the similarity between both attacks, but without physical evidence, the suspect remained unidentified. Then on April 23rd, 22-year-old Linda Sally set out to buy a gift for her boyfriend. As she walked through a mall parking lot, Jerry approached her, flashing a fake police badge. He accused her of shoplifting and threatened to arrest her unless she followed his instructions. After bringing Linda to his garage, Jerry restrained her, leaving her tied up while he went about his day. Although she didn't attempt to escape, she fought back when he returned and tried to strangle her with a leather strap. Unfortunately, her resistance wasn't enough to save her life. Once she was lifeless, he indulged in his usual twisted rituals, but this time, he hesitated to mutilate her body. He found her skin too soft, too unmarked for his usual gruesome acts. Instead, he experimented with electricity, attempting to make her corpse twitch under the current, an attempt that ultimately failed. Unsatisfied, he followed his familiar disposal method. He tied her remains to a car transmission and dumped them into a river. The following day, Linda never showed up for work. Her car was found abandoned, just like the others, with no sign of a struggle or robbery. As in previous cases, her disappearance left investigators without any immediate leads. Suspicion briefly fell on her boyfriend, but there was nothing to connect him to her vanishing. By this point, the Oregon police began to notice patterns among the missing women. They built a timeline, realizing that all the victims had disappeared in the latter half of each month. Most were young white women, many of them students, last seen in public places, mainly parking lots. However, despite these observations, they had no physical evidence to pursue. That was until an unexpected discovery changed everything. On May 10, 1969, a fisherman spotted what looked like a bundled package floating in the water. When he approached, he realized it was something far more sinister, the weighted-down body of a woman. Still wearing her coat, the corpse had been tied to a heavy toolbox. Authorities arrived quickly, and forensic analysis soon identified the remains as one of the recently missing women, Linda Sally. The autopsy confirmed she had been strangled, with additional post-mortem injuries that stood out. 2 puncture wounds, one on each side of her rib cage, were surrounded by burn marks, evidence that someone had used electric shocks on her body. Investigators were now certain they were dealing with a sadistic killer, someone who took pleasure in tormenting his victims even after death. 2 days later, as divers continued searching the river, they made another grim discovery. A second body, severely decomposed and tied to the engine of a car, was pulled from the water. The bindings matched those found on Linda, suggesting the killer was responsible for both murders. The victim had been strangled, likely with a leather strap. Investigators strongly suspected the second body belonged to Karen. Her mother had described the outfit she was wearing when she disappeared, and the clothing on the recovered body matched, except for one detail. The victim was also wearing an oversized black bra, stuffed with crumpled brown paper towels. It became clear that this was part of the killer's bizarre fantasies. When dental records confirmed the body was indeed Karen, detectives realized they were officially hunting a serial murderer. Determined to track him down, investigators built a psychological profile of the suspect. He was likely between 20 and 30 years old, had experience with electrical work, evidenced by the copper wiring used to restrain victims, and was methodical in his actions. The double knots used on the bindings suggested someone skilled with their hands, possibly a technician or engineer. They also theorized that he had grown up in a household dominated by an abusive mother, which could explain his deep-seated rage toward women. Despite this promising profile, they still had no clear suspect. Turning to the social circles of Karen, detectives visited her university. They questioned her classmates, hoping to uncover any unusual encounters before her disappearance. Several students reported receiving disturbing phone calls from a man pressuring them to go on dates. Others mentioned a suspicious red-haired heavy-set man frequently seen loitering around campus. The breakthrough came when one student recounted a recent meeting with a man claiming to be a war veteran who just wanted someone to talk to. She had agreed to meet him on campus and provided a description. He was tall, had light-colored hair, and was covered in freckles. This matched the descriptions given by previous victims who had narrowly escaped. The student recalled that during their conversation, the man had made unsettling comments about the missing women whose bodies had recently been found in the river. When he invited her for a walk, she declined, sensing something was off. Before leaving, he promised to call her again the following week. Now, detectives saw an opportunity. They urged the young woman to accept his next call and arrange another meeting while police prepared to intervene. On May 25th, as expected, the man called again. The student agreed to meet him, and an hour later, he arrived at the university. He was exactly as described, tall, freckled, and overweight. Detectives, who had been waiting nearby, immediately took notice. When questioned, the man introduced himself politely. His name was Jerry Brutos. He explained that he worked as an electrician, lived in Salem with his wife and 2 children, and seemed completely at ease. His composure was unsettling. There was no nervousness, no sign that he felt threatened by the police's presence. Lacking concrete evidence to detain him, detectives had no choice but to let him go. However, before he left, they noted the license plate number of his car. Back at the station, investigators ran his information through the police database and uncovered two crucial details. First, Brudos had a history of psychiatric treatment for disturbing sexual behavior. Second, records showed that Linda Sally, the missing encyclopedia saleswoman, had been in his neighborhood shortly before she disappeared. It was the first real link connecting him to the crimes. Determined to confront their prime suspect, detectives made their way to Brudos' home in Salem. As one detective engaged Jerry in conversation, the other discreetly examined his home, eventually reaching the garage. There, he found more copper wires, some tied in the same intricate knots that had been discovered on the victims pulled from the river. Suspended from the ceiling was a sturdy hook, eerily similar to what had been described in the forensic reports. Suspicion mounting, police obtained a warrant to search Brudos' car. Inside, they found that the interior had been meticulously cleaned too thoroughly, as if he had tried to erase any trace of evidence. Though this alone wasn't enough to charge him, detectives soon remembered the statement given by Gloria, the 15-year-old girl who had escaped an attempted abduction. They arranged a police lineup, and when Gloria was brought in, she immediately identified Brudos as the man who had tried to force her into his vehicle. This was the break they needed. Brudos was arrested and held on multiple charges, including possession of an illegal firearm, as a gun had been found in his vehicle. Realizing that police were closing in on him, he instructed his wife to burn his collection of women's clothing and lingerie, items that could directly link him to his crimes. However, Darcy, who had long grown tired of her husband's disturbing behavior, did not comply. Instead, she allowed investigators full access to the garage, leading to the discovery of what would later be known as the Chamber of Horrors. On May 29, 1969, Brudos was formally taken into custody as police conducted a second, more thorough search of his home. This time, they uncovered a hidden stash of women's high-heeled shoes, along with an extensive collection of lingerie, including bras, girdles, panties, and slips. But the most damning evidence was a set of photographs, images so disturbing that they left no doubt about his guilt. Among them were pictures of Brudos himself dressed in women's undergarments, but far more chilling were the photographs of his victims. One image depicted a lifeless body dressed in various outfits, posed as though it were still alive. However, one photograph sealed his fate. It showed a young woman dressed in black lace lingerie and garters, suspended from the ceiling by a rope. A mirror on the floor reflected the gruesome scene from below, and in the lower corner of the frame, the reflection of the killer was captured, Brudos himself, staring with satisfaction at the corpse he had just posed. Initially, Brudos denied any involvement in the murders. However, under intense questioning, he finally broke. He admitted to murdering and mutilating 4 women, tossing their remains into the river after keeping select body parts as souvenirs. What struck investigators most was his complete lack of remorse. He spoke with enthusiasm about his fetish for women's shoes, underwear, and the thrill he felt posing his victims. He expressed no regret for their suffering, only for his own fate, lamenting that his life was ruined and feeling sorry for his wife and children. On June 4, 1969, Brudos was officially indicted. He initially pleaded not guilty, and his trial soon became a media sensation. He attempted to claim insanity, portraying himself as a victim of an abusive mother who had shaped his deviant tendencies. He even wept before psychiatrists, hoping to gain their sympathy. But the experts weren't fooled. 7 psychologists reviewed his case and rejected his insanity plea, diagnosing him instead with antisocial personality disorder. They concluded that, while he was deeply disturbed, he was fully aware that his actions were wrong. He was described as a narcissistic psychopath with a high IQ, calculated, manipulative, and entirely self-absorbed. Realizing there was no chance of an acquittal, Brudos changed his plea. He confessed to the murders of John Whitney, Karen Sprinker, and Linda Saley. He also admitted to killing Linda Slauson, the encyclopedia saleswoman, but was never convicted for her murder, as no remains were found, nor did he keep photographs of her. On June 28, 1969, the court sentenced Brudos to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. His reign of terror was officially over. His wife, Darcy, was briefly arrested and investigated as a potential accomplice. A neighbor claimed to have seen her assisting Brudos with one of his victims, but there was no concrete evidence to support the claim. Without proof of her direct involvement, she was acquitted. In 1970, she divorced Brudos, changed her name, and disappeared with their children, severing all ties to the notorious killer. Meanwhile, Brutos was sent to Oregon State Penitentiary, where he maintained a well-behaved facade. He remained obsessed with high heels, even writing to shoe companies, requesting catalogs as a substitute for his fantasies. Life in prison wasn't easy for him, however. He was frequently targeted by fellow inmates, one of whom slashed his neck in an attack that required multiple stitches. After that, Brutos withdrew from the spotlight, refusing interviews out of fear that his notoriety would incite more violence against him. Over the years, he filed numerous appeals, including one in which he argued that the infamous photograph of him with one of his victims was inadmissible because the victim wasn't one of the 3 women he had been convicted of killing. He also cited medical issues, claiming he had suffered from blackouts during his crimes, and that reality had become increasingly distorted for him. In June 1995, he made one last attempt at freedom, arguing that he was no longer a danger to society. The Oregon Parole Board swiftly rejected his request, stating that he would remain behind bars for the rest of his life. There would be no further hearings. His final years were marked by declining health. After suffering from liver cancer for several years, he died in the prison infirmary on March 28, 2006, at the age of 67. At the time of his death, he was the longest-serving inmate in the Oregon Department of Corrections. Case 5. April and David Bever lived with their 7 children and pet dog, Sally, in what most outside observers considered a life that didn't warrant much attention. Not much is known about the couple's early life other than the fact that they married when April was 15, according to her. In 2007, April and David moved their young and growing family of 4 children to a large home in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, the 4th largest city in the state, nestled just outside of Tulsa. At 5 bedrooms, 4.5 baths, it was one of the largest and most expensive homes on the block, and they would eventually need it. David worked in IT for an oil and natural gas company in Tulsa, while April stayed home to reportedly homeschool the children, even though there was no evidence that she did. None of the local homeschool groups had any interactions with the family. The main objective of homeschooling appeared to be to prevent the children from interacting with the outside world, including even other children. Their outside play was generally restricted to the backyard, and outside activities were not allowed. Neighbors rarely saw the children and seldom saw the parents either. In general, neighbors regarded them as a quiet and reclusive family. Coworkers at David's job described him as a quiet, nice person who kept to himself and didn't get involved in office politics. By 2015, David and April had 3 more children since moving into the home, 7 children in all, ranging in age from 2 to 18 years old. The oldest, Robert, was 18. Michael was 16. Crystal, 13. Daniel, 12. Christopher, 7. 5-year-old Victoria, and 2-year-old Autumn. The 2 oldest siblings, Michael and Robert, were inseparable. The younger brother looked up to his older brother, and they spent all their time together, bonding over similar interests like online gaming. And while the family was living in relative obscurity, all of that would change on the late night of July 22, 2015. While the audio quality is low, yelling can be heard in the background as an attack ensues. The dispatcher tries calling back, but there is no answer. Officers are dispatched to the scene. When police arrive, they immediately notice blood on the front porch. They knock on the front door and hear a voice calling for help. They force their way into the house to find 13-year-old Crystal just inside the doorway, with multiple stab wounds and laying in a pool of blood. They quickly drag her out of the house and call for backup. They re-enter the home, not certain whether there are other victims or if the attacker is still inside the home. There is blood everywhere. Next, they find the mother, April, and 12-year-old Daniel, not sure whether they are still alive. They carry them out to the front yard in case they are. Returning, they next find Dad, David. It is clear that he is deceased, so they leave him and continue searching the home. Next, they encounter a locked bathroom door. Not sure whether the attackers have barricaded themselves inside, they kick it down. But there are no attackers inside. Instead, they find the lifeless bodies of 7-year-old Christopher and 5-year-old Victoria. The detective who found them said it was the worst thing he has ever seen. They proceed upstairs to find 2-year-old Autumn laying in her crib, alive and asleep. She has slept through the entire massacre. By that point, all hands were on deck. With murders in Broken Arrow being a rarity, the full weight of law enforcement would ultimately be summoned to 709 Magnolia, including the K-9 unit, the entire detective force, firefighters, and paramedics. So, while officers continued searching and investigating the home, other officers noticed the back door was open and saw fresh footprints. The K-9 unit was put on the job to track the fleeing attackers. And it didn't take long to find them. Just 4 minutes. It was the two oldest brothers, Robert and Michael. They were hiding in the wooded area behind the home, hunkered down in the dirt. Officers instructed the pair to come out with their hands up. Robert complied, but Michael did not. So AK-9 escorted him out of his spot, leaving bite marks on his right shoulder. The boys, covered in dirt and blood, were apprehended. And as they were being placed in the patrol cars, Robert said to his younger brother, "It's been a pleasure. I'm proud of what I've done." Photos of the murderous duo were captured at the time of their arrest. They reflected both the horrors that had taken place just moments before and, disturbingly, the grotesque satisfaction that was obvious on the older brother's face. Police secured the boys in patrol cars while they continued processing the scene. From the car, they could see the aftermath of what they'd caused, including officers carrying off their 2-year-old sister, alive. They prepared to take the boys back to the station for interrogation. At some point prior to the interrogations, Robert and Michael were allowed to talk privately and freely amongst themselves. Once the interrogations began, the boys were questioned separately. While the older Robert's interrogation footage remains sealed from public access, younger Michael's is not. We can only imagine what must have been contained in Robert's testimony as compared to Michael's that got his conversation sealed and unobtainable. Those interrogations, later trial testimony, and statements from the surviving sister began painting a picture that authorities and the community were nowhere near prepared for. Statements from the brothers, as well as the surviving sister from that point through the trial, outlined a scenario that continues to haunt authorities and the community to this day. Once the interrogations were underway, detectives quickly learned that this was not a spur-of-the-moment attack. The brothers had hatched their murder plan over a year before it happened. The pair were already as close as brothers could be. Having been isolated from other children and people in general, Robert and Michael relied on each other. They shared all their thoughts with each other and often talked late into the night in the room they shared together. According to Robert, they almost never left the house, typically going months without leaving. The parents also rarely left the home, only leaving to go to the grocery store every once in a while. And when they were home, the parents would typically lock themselves in their respective offices. There were even cameras in the hallways and in the kids' rooms, which their father used to monitor what the family was doing. And while the children were said to be homeschooled, Robert claimed otherwise. He described he and his siblings as being self-educated, learning from websites their mother would point them to. Robert said he himself taught Michael from 3rd through 5th grade, and based on how Michael wrote, it appeared to Robert that he had dyslexia. That was never determined, but what was clear was that Michael had a speech impediment, the result of which was their father yelling at him to stop and don't talk until you can speak clearly, and also shaking Michael because he was stuttering. So Michael trusted his older brother wholeheartedly and looked up to him. Once the late-night talks between the brothers revealed that they were both fascinated by killing, murders and murderers consumed their conversations and their online activity. Because while April and David were busy insulating their children from the evils of the outside world, they let that world into their home, free and unfettered, via the internet. The children had access to multiple devices, with both Michael and Robert owning 2 laptops, each amongst other devices. And they were free to access anything they wanted, no restrictions whatsoever. And that included access to the most heinous murders the pair could find, particularly those that involved multiple murders. They began to idolize serial killers like Ted Bundy and Richard Ramirez, and movie theater and school shootings like the one at Columbine, specifically noting the notoriety the killers drew. And with Robert's disdain for society in general, it was a deadly mix. Okay, did you kind of feel that way too? Like when you guys were talking earlier. Like, do you have a problem with society too, do you think? No, not just, or you were just more like the number of people getting killed was kind of interesting and exciting. Yeah, okay. So, because you mentioned a couple of names, are those like serial killers or something? What, like Columbine? Yeah, Columbine and James Hayden Holmes. James Hayden Holmes is the guy that shot up the theater. In Colorado? Yeah, he killed 12. How many were killed in Columbine? Columbine? I don't know, like 15, I think. Robert also felt that if he killed enough people, he would eventually kill someone who was not contributing to society, which would be a good thing. and that killing just a single person would not have an impact on society. But killing multiple people made him almost godlike, and their open and regular talk about mass murderers and killing their family wasn't just talk. Robert got a job at a Christian call center to earn money to buy the equipment they needed, including knives, guns, body armor, helmets, and ammunition. Their sister Crystal, who survived the attack, heard several of their conversations. At one point, over a year prior to the attack, they even asked her whether she would help them kill the entire family. Rightfully concerned, Crystal shared the highly troubling conversations about killing the family with their mother, including that they'd not just talked, but purchased knives, bulletproof vests, and more. But April was not concerned. Her response was that, that's just what boys do, and that, they're looking for attention. Their father was only upset that the boys were wasting their money. As the boys' obsession grew, they compared the killings of other mass shootings and vowed that theirs would be bigger than others. In their minds, outdoing previous mass murders would bring them the most fame. Did you guys talk about being on the news and getting to see each other on TV and stuff? Yep. What kind of things did you say and talk about? We were saying about how we were planning on killing more people. Yeah, and that we would become famous. We'd get on Wikipedia lists. Oh, okay. People. That'd be a big deal, yeah. I mean, did you think they might even make a movie or something? Or a TV show? I thought that would be a TV show, but, did you guys talk about that? Yeah, I think they talked about it. You just wanted to be famous. And what did you want? Me? I think you kind of know what you wanted. What did you want? Oh, nice one. You got a lot of letters for me. Good job. Thank you. And the event itself. The killers are almost an afterthought. We assume by design. While trying to nail down the details of their plans, the detective asked about why they decided to use knives for the killings. So was the plan, to use the knives at first on the family? Yeah, to use the knives. Because the guns weren't going to be here until later on. Yeah, and the guns would be too loud. Oh, I see. So, to use the knives on the family, which obviously did not go as planned. Yeah, thank God. Yeah, oh, I just hope that's what I meant. Like, we didn't put more people at the killings. Yeah, damn. The guns would be too loud. And, despite his conflicting facial expressions when he said it, Michael was right. Nothing went as planned. Or at least, not like they saw it in the movies. Detectives tried to draw out Michael's feelings about his parents. Do you guys not like your mom and dad? I mean, most teenagers don't like their parents, so I can understand that. Yeah, I mean, mom's okay with that just a little bit too much. But while Michael's feelings about his parents didn't seem to reflect his actions, Robert's did. Robert hated his parents and had been fantasizing about killing them since he was 13 after, he claims. They beat him, and so the plan was devised. The original time frame for the attack was slated to be September. But, as all the pieces started falling in place, they realized they were prepared to start killing earlier. They had been collecting knives for months. And once Robert turned 18, he found out that he could legally purchase guns. That's when he announced his final plan to Michael. Michael would later write about how, when Robert told him about that final plan to kill everyone in the house, then go on a killing spree across the country. He said that his response was that he thought it was a great idea. They started by ordering the guns online and having them delivered to a local gun store where they could pick them up. Once the gun store called and told them the guns had arrived and were ready for pickup, they began coordinating their timing. They ordered over 2,000 rounds of ammunition to be delivered to their home. Once they knew the day the ammo would arrive, they planned to murder their family the day before to prevent them from seeing it. Then, once their family was out of the way, they could freely receive the delivery, then pick up the weapons without question. Okay. Did you know where you were going to drive to? Washington State. Washington State. Why would you go to Washington State? Was it good? And you said Yukon? Did your parents have money in Yukon? Yeah. The plan was to slaughter their family with knives, dismember them, then store them in tubs in the attic. They would then clean up the mess and wait until they had their hands on the ammunition and weapons the next day, then steal the family's vehicle to begin their killing spree, journeying to the randomly chosen Washington State, killing batches of 5 or so people at a time at restaurants and gas stations along the route, hoping to reach a kill count of over 100. Although even that plan was flawed. Okay. As the detectives continued establishing a rapport with Michael to get him to share as much about the night's events as possible, a cut he sustained during the attack began bleeding again. His bleeding finger was a subtle reminder that this interrogation was taking place just a handful of hours after the massacre, at approximately 7 a.m. the morning following the midnight attacks, to be precise. The fact that Michael is able to relay the accounts of the evening in such a calm, detached manner is unsettling, but apparently less disturbing than his brother's sealed interrogation. Detectives reported that during Robert's interrogation, he regularly laughed and chuckled while describing the attacks, at times becoming mildly excited. The brothers also planned to document their rampage, so they'd have something to boast about. They intended to create two versions of their family's killings, one that included the bodies of their family, and one without the bodies that could be released online to the public. Michael's interrogation continued, and while he was forthcoming with all their detailed plans when it came to detailing the actual murders, Michael downplayed his involvement. One by one, he described how Robert did all of the killing while he just stood by and watched. They started attacking there. They got in a little bit of a fight, but they eventually, got him down, and I think he killed him. Did he cut his throat too? Where did that happen? In your room. In your room? Yep. And, where were you? I was standing in the hallway. Okay. So did you see him cut your dad's throat? He would eventually fess up to stabbing his 7-year-old brother, Christopher, one time in the neck. But police still don't buy it. Because here's what I'm seeing happen. You guys had all these detailed plans. You had all the cool stuff to make it happen. And it kind of started falling apart. And you said like it didn't go as planned. Did you kind of just freak out a little bit? Like, yeah, it's really happening. Well, I didn't know I was going to be like, yeah, you don't. But here's what's getting me is like, it's crazy because you guys worked together and made all these plans and, had it all figured out. And then when it happens, you're just kind of standing there not doing anything. And did you decide like, Robert's going to kill everybody and I'm going to stand here and do nothing? So did you? Yeah, I think that was my plan. I didn't mean to kill anyone. I love anyone. I couldn't do it. So I just wanted to let him like kill everyone. Yeah, but you stabbed somebody in the neck. I just kind of, what I'm saying is it's not Robert's the one that should get all the credit here. Yeah, because it's a big deal. You're going to be on the news. You know what I mean? People are going to want to interview you. Yeah, I don't want to be interviewed when I'm doing this. Well, but I'm just thinking. He does. Because you had said you had the plans, like, you're supposed to kill this person. Yeah, he's supposed to kill this person. Were you supposed to kill Christopher? Was he your responsibility? No, it just worked out that way. At this point in time, it was supposed to be his responsibility. I was the one that was supposed to kill Dad, and to help with the killing and everything. But he had already basically done that. Yeah, so now you're left standing there. So were you trying to kill Christopher when you stabbed him in the neck? Were you just going to? I broke his neck. I think I might have hit him in the shoulder. I just don't remember how I did that. They ask him how he feels about it all. But that was like, because it's 8 o'clock in the morning now. So it's like an hour to go. So how do you feel now? Just kind of. I didn't want to do that. Yeah, I just didn't want that to happen. Police give him an opportunity to tell the truth about his involvement. But he sticks with his story that he only stabbed Christopher. And only once. So here's a problem that we might have. And I don't want it to be an issue for you, because you've been really cooperative. We're going to talk to Robert too. So he's going to give us his version of the story. And, sometimes they're going to be different. So is there anything that you kind of didn't quite tell me, right? Or you changed a little bit? And now that you understand that Robert's going to tell me everything, how can I tell you that I can forget about him? Because that's why I told him, when we were sitting out in the woods, to make conversation about, if I was going to associate with Christopher. What 3? What do you mean you told him? So you told him you killed 3 men? Yeah, I told him because he asked me how many did you do. I said 3. So did you tell him who you got? No, I just said 3. So I guess this is my question for you. Do you think it's a lesser sentence if you killed 1 or if you killed 3? No. Okay. Well, I don't know. I think Robert, there's going to be a lot of differences. That's what I'm concerned about. And we don't want you to come off as a liar. Because you've been real cooperative. You seem like a really good kid. You graduated high school early. You're designing games. There's all kinds of stuff you got going on. And so I don't want people to get a bad opinion of you and think that you're the type of guy that lies to police when it's kind of caught. You know what I mean? Tell me, I know that you're leaving something out. Because it's like she said, this isn't like you stole a bicycle. This is the most you can do. So it's a big deal. But a lot of people, when they talk and think about this thing, your honesty is a big deal and how you handle yourself from here on out. And if you come off, because to me, you don't seem like a bad guy. You don't scare me. I never thought you would have done this. So you just seem like a normal kid to me. And you seem like an honest kid. But see, I talk to people all the time. And I know when people are lying or when I'm not quite getting the whole story. And so I just want to catch you before you get in that bad spot where people start saying you're a bad guy, you're evil, you're a liar. So just tell me what I'm missing. He doesn't waver. He claims that the worst he's responsible for is deceiving the victims. More on that in a moment. About a minute later, both interrogating detectives leave the room. After a couple more minutes away, they return. I was right. The guys that are interviewing Robert kind of give me a quick version of what he's saying that you did. And you haven't told me everything. Okay, so I know you're not being completely honest. And I gave you one shot already. I'm sorry. I don't believe what I said. I don't know. Well, you stabbed more than one person. So who else did you stab? I don't know what you're saying. Or you stabbed more than just one time. Oh, I stabbed just one time. How many times did you stab him? I think twice. Because you don't think we're going to know that. Stop thinking and go with what you know. You mentioned forensics a minute ago. I know. I'm just one of like hundreds of people that are going to look at this thing. Okay, I know. We got the state police coming in. There's, 20 different forensic detectives at your house right now. They're going to be there a long time, because it's a scene that it is. So everybody that you killed and every single stabbed one that you inflicted, we're going to know about. And this is your last chance to just kind of let us know, to be honest, to band up and tell us exactly what you did and start making it right. I didn't press the button. I did not stab Victoria or Daniel. You did not stab Victoria? Yeah, I tried to stab them all. You stabbed them all? Yeah, but she was walking away. I tried to go for her neck, but, is that when you cut yourself, you think? Yeah, I think that's after that. Where did you stab her? I tried to go from behind the car, but, did you cut her? I think so, yeah. This doesn't seem like something you have to think about. I know you're still kind of dealing with it. And I wasn't there. I wasn't the one doing it. But you don't have to think about it. I know. You know what you did. So, you cut her neck. You stabbed Christopher in the neck. How many times did you stab Christopher? 2 or 3, I think. And who else did you stab? Besides Mom. Because here's the thing. Everybody's been stabbed. And you both had knives. And we know you both stabbed everybody. So you guys are kind of at the same level. And so now it's, who's going to be honest and make this right? And who's a liar, okay? Which one do you want to be? I'm not. Okay, so you're a man of your word? Yes. Okay. Do you want to make this right? And do the right thing at this point in time? Yes. Okay. What else are you missing? He has added his mother, but won't fess up to stabbing anyone beyond her and Christopher. He claims he only participated in the killings because Robert said that he'd kill him if he didn't. The second investigator switches gears and asks for clarification on why they decided to kill their family. And so, you only stabbed your family because they were in the way. Towards the bigger plan? Well, the reason we just kind of killed the family is they were in the way. And higher count. That's powerful. Just to start off with the big count. So, is this all a game? This higher count, is this a game? Well, it's kind of become famous. Set a record. How do you feel about what you've done now? I didn't like it the minute it started. How do you feel about your mother? You watched her get stabbed. You cut her throat yourself, and you watched her bleed all over the place and scream. How does that make you feel? I don't want to think about it. You don't want to think about it? And Christopher, your little brother? You stabbed him in the neck. What has he ever done to you? Nothing. So he's just a number? Yes. And how do you feel about that now? It's pointless. It's what? Pointless. Detectives had heard enough. No more questions after that. Despite Michael's claim of limited involvement, forensic evidence along with statements and testimony from the brothers and surviving sister told a different story. They would reveal the full gruesome events that unfolded that night. The brothers planned for their family's massacre to begin at midnight after everyone had gone to bed. They would then kill each family member, one by one, even the baby, as Michael refers to her in his handwritten statement. First, Michael would kill their father with a crossbow. Then Robert would slit their mother's throat. At about 11:30 p.m., Everyone in the home was asleep except the two older brothers, the mother April and Crystal. April asked Crystal to remind her older brothers that they needed to do the dishes. Crystal went to their room and found that they had put on body armor. She'd also noticed several knives that they had laid out on the bed. She had seen them wear body armor before and also knew about their extensive collection of knives. So she began to leave the room when Michael asked Robert, "Should we do it right now?" Robert replied yes and called her back in, telling her to look at something on Michael's computer. As she looked over Michael's shoulder in his computer, Robert stood behind her, put his hand over her mouth, and slashed her throat. The boys expected her to die instantly and quietly, after which they would drag her body to the closet. But she didn't. Instead, she screamed and fought, and she ran. And there was blood everywhere. Hearing all the screaming, April came running into the room. So Robert began stabbing her as well. She started running and screaming for someone in the house to call 911. This is the point where Robert claimed to police that he realized that killing people was a lot harder than he thought it would be. As Robert shifted to attacking his mother, Crystal frantically looked for a cell phone and yelled at her younger sister Victoria to lock herself in the bathroom. Unable to find his cell phone, Crystal headed to the front door to sound the alarm. She made it to the front yard where she passed out. As Robert headed to the front yard to retrieve Crystal, he left his mother behind for Michael to finish off, which he did. April fought aggressively, but could not survive her 48 stab wounds. She'd had more wounds than I've ever seen in any body. Ever, according to one investigator. In the yard, Robert reached Crystal and seeing that she was still alive tried to strangle her. She started playing dead at that point, so he dragged her from the front yard to the front porch, then told Michael to bring her the rest of the way into the house, so they could go and find the rest of the children. Michael dragged a presumably dead Crystal just inside the entryway, so they could later dismember her along with the rest of the family. Then he rejoined Robert to continue their plan. Meanwhile, 70-year-old Christopher had locked himself in one of the bathrooms with his 5-year-old sister, Victoria. And back to that deception mentioned earlier. When Robert asked younger Michael where everyone was, Michael told him they were hiding. Then Michael went to the bathroom where Christopher and Victoria were hiding, knocked on the door and said, "Let me in. He's gonna kill me." When they unlocked the door to rescue their brother from Robert, Michael stabbed both of them to death. Christopher was stabbed 21 times, and Victoria 23. So I guess where I'm kind of confused is if you didn't want this anymore, and you didn't want this to go down this way, why con them into opening the doors and letting this continue? I was just gonna tell her I was gonna tell her. Michael would eventually own up to being a person who stabbed both Christopher and Victoria prior to his trial. 12-year-old Daniel was also hiding, having locked himself in his father's office, which was right next to the bathroom where Christopher and Victoria were just stabbed. He had Michael's cell phone and called 911. Michael used the same trick to get Daniel to open the door, claiming that Robert was attacking him. The young boy let him in. Michael took the phone from Daniel and smashed it, after which he told Robert, "He's all yours." Robert began stabbing Daniel, who managed to run away. But he only made it to the living room near his mother, where he collapsed and died. His call to 911 likely saved his surviving sisters' lives. He was stabbed 21 times. The father, David, had been sleeping upstairs during the ordeal. Once he was awakened by the commotion, he came downstairs. As soon as he saw what was happening, he charged at Robert. But Robert was able to stab his father in the chest, sending him to the floor, where Robert continued stabbing him until he too was dead. He was stabbed over 28 times. Robert would later comment on how he was glad he was wearing Kevlar sleeves during the attacks because several of his family members tried to bite him, and he was glad to be protected by the sleeves. Nearly all 6 victims had defensive wounds in their attempts to fight off their attackers, even young Victoria. Most were stabbed in some combination of their head, face, neck, chest, back, abdomen, and arms. Shortly after killing Daniel, they heard a knock on the door. They knew it wasn't the police because with Crystal now screaming just inside the doorway, police would certainly have made their way in. So figuring it was a neighbor, they panicked, quickly put their vests and helmets on, made an unsuccessful attempt to find their mother's keys to the car, then abandoned the rest of their plan to dismember the bodies, obtain the ammo and weapons, and flee in the family vehicle, which was out front and inaccessible since someone was at the front door. Instead, they ran out the back door, over the fence, and into the wooded area behind their house. Also, since they were rushed by the knock at the door, they forgot about their last intended victim, the baby. They had planned to decapitate her with an axe. The moment they got to the familiar wooded area, The boys collapsed in exhaustion from all the stabbing. They knew exactly when the police arrived because they could hear the sirens approaching. Then the dogs. But they didn't move. With Michael not surrendering voluntarily, the canine dragged him out. An event which apparently did not have a traumatic effect on him. Okay. While law enforcement and emergency responders continued clearing the home, 2-year-old Autumn was moved to safety, and Crystal, who immediately named her 2 older brothers as the attackers, was whisked to a hospital to be treated for her life-threatening wounds, including being slashed across her stomach so severely that her internal organs protruded and needed to be surgically placed back inside of her. Paramedics were shocked that she was still alive given her condition. Once police searched the home, they recovered a thumb drive that had some live footage from the rampage, but specifics about what was contained had not been made public. Each brother was charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of assault and battery with a deadly weapon. Both initially pleaded not guilty. Robert would eventually change his plea to guilty in a plea deal that involved prosecutors not seeking the death penalty against him. Crystal Bever asked the district attorney to make sure that Robert never gets out of prison. Robert Bever received the maximum penalty short of death, which was 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole for the 5 first-degree murder charges, plus an additional life sentence for the assault with the intent to kill charge. He was also ordered to pay a $1,000 fine and $6,000 in victims' compensation. Michael's trial began on April 20, 2018. His defense attorney fought against him being tried as an adult, but in Oklahoma, 15 to 17-year-olds charged with first-degree murder must be tried as adults. At the beginning of the trial, the judge ruled that both Michael's confession and the extensive journal of photos that he had drawn in jail could be used in court, including his crayon depictions of the killings and the people involved. Both Crystal and Robert were called to testify. Now 21, Robert testified that he was the one who killed all of his family members and insisted that all Michael did was persuade their siblings to open their locked doors. However, his testimony frequently contradicted both the evidence and Crystal's testimony. The prosecution called him on it. His response was that he lied during most of his police interview, telling police what he wanted to happen, not what actually happened. He also claimed that he lied to police about Michael killing, so that Michael could get some credit in case they became famous. A lot of Robert's testimony also revolved around their upbringing, and specifically that he and his siblings were commonly physically and mentally abused by their father. He recalled 2 instances where their dad had punched and kicked Michael. He called that common behavior for their dad. Robert also described how his father once dragged him up the stairs for leaving the light on, and his mother once slapped him so hard that it left a mark on his face, to which she joked that he looked like the Joker. She thought it was hilarious. He was furious. Robert believed that his parents hated all of their kids, and that they only kept having them for the tax benefit. He also described in graphic detail every move he made while performing the killings, right down to how the blood felt in his hands, and how his mother prayed out loud for him while he was stabbing her. Crystal confirmed the abuse allegations. Her victim impact statement, read for her by her adoptive mother, expressed fear that Michael would be released and kill her to finish what he started. The jury found Michael guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 5 life sentences with the possibility of parole for the first-degree murder charges, plus 28 years for the assault, all to be served consecutively. At least half of the jurors openly wept as the verdict was being read, prompting the bailiff to pass out tissues. After the verdict was handed down, Michael attempted to sit down, but fell on the floor and had to be helped back into his seat by an officer. Robert is currently serving his sentence in the Joseph Hart Correctional Center, while Michael resides at the Lexington Correctional Center. Both are medium-security prisons located in Lexington, Oklahoma. Since being imprisoned, Robert has inked 2 sets of tattoos on his hands. On one hand, it says LUPEX 5, which stands for Life Without Parole times 5. His other hand says Life. In July 2019, at age 24, Robert attacked prison staff with an 8-inch long sharpened instrument. He tried to attack them from behind, but guards overpowered him. Robert pleaded guilty to assault and battery and received an additional 3 life sentences, tacked onto his existing 6. Michael's defense attempted to appeal his sentence, claiming that the state rules prohibiting life sentences for juveniles was violated. Each individual life sentence with possibility of parole was allowed, but with the multiple life sentences strung back to back, it amounted to a life sentence without possibility of parole. The appeal made it to the Supreme Court, which ruled that child murderers should not get a volume discount when they kill multiple people, and that the decision to make the sentences consecutive was within their discretion. The former Beaver home where the murders took place was listed for sale, but there were no takers. In February of 2017, the Tulsa Community Foundation began a fundraising campaign to turn the home into a memorial garden. A month later, the home was mysteriously burned down. Authorities suspected arson, but a culprit was never identified. Shortly after that, the foundation reached its $50,000 fundraising goal, bought the house, and turned the deed over to the city of Tulsa to turn the home into one of the city's parks. The home was demolished, and the resulting park was dedicated the following year. Sally, the family dog who remained quiet in a crate in an upstairs closet during the massacre, went unnoticed until about 16 hours after the massacre. A neighbor decided to take Sally in just in case either of the survivors ever wanted to come get her back. While the surviving children Crystal and Autumn were placed in state custody, their whereabouts and lives after that are unknown, with authorities sealing all information from the public for their protection. We hope this video did justice to all the victims of this senseless massacre. This case was a constant head shaker. Tulsa County DA Steve Kunzweiler summed it up best, recalling the scene on that tragic night. "It is seared into my memory. I will not presume to know how or why people choose to do the things they do, which bring harm to innocent lives." Case 6. It all began on a late afternoon in early July 2003. The bustling streets of Maoming City were suddenly interrupted by screams and a violent altercation. In one corner of the street, a disheveled, filthy woman was furiously hitting a middle-aged man. The woman, later identified as Bing, seemed out of control, clutching the man's shirt with trembling hands. Her eyes were filled with terror and panic as bystanders watched without daring to intervene. The man, meanwhile, was trying to dodge her blows, pleading for mercy. His face bore scratches from her nails, and Bing's relentless shouting only escalated the chaos. When police arrived on the scene, they quickly intervened, separating the two and taking them to the station. The man, identified as Lang Ah-shung, hung his head low, avoiding everyone's gaze, while Bing sat in a corner, muttering nonsensical words with vacant eyes. Bing's erratic behavior caught the officer's attention. One moment she was moaning in pain, the next, she was giggling uncontrollably. She didn't appear mentally stable. This immediately led the police to suspect that this was no ordinary altercation. During interrogation, when asked about his relationship with Bing, Lang Ah-shung stammered, "I don't know her, she attacked me out of nowhere." But his shifty eyes made the officer skeptical. After hours of relentless questioning, Lang Ah-shung began to crack. Sweating profusely and visibly panicked, he repeatedly pleaded, "I'm not the mastermind. I was just following orders. Please don't arrest me." Lang Ah-shung's confession steered the investigation in an unexpected direction. The police quickly realized that the situation might be far more complex than initially thought. When pressed for details, Lang Ah-shung broke down, admitting his involvement in a larger scheme while insisting that he was merely a pawn. At the same time, Bing's incoherent ramblings started to make sense. She kept repeating, "The women, they never see the light, the doors are locked forever." The police decided to detain both of them for further investigation. While Lang Ah-shung underwent more questioning, a dedicated team began piecing together clues from Bing's strange statements. A large-scale investigation was launched, focusing on nearby areas to identify suspicious activities. Thus began the unveiling of one of Maoming's most horrifying crimes. Lang Ah-shung admitted to being a mere pawn for Lee Jia-chuan, a 69-year-old man living in isolation in Thai village, Nanching Town, Maoming City. He revealed that Lee Jia-chuan had been keeping numerous mentally ill women, including Bing, captive in his house. According to his testimony, these women were chained by their feet and confined in a house hidden amidst fish ponds and dense vegetation. Acting on this information, on the night of July 6, 2003, a convoy of police vehicles slowly made its way into Thai village. The bumpy dirt road led them through overgrown bushes and winding canals, eventually bringing them to a two-story brick house standing desolate in a barren landscape. The house resembled a decaying fortress. Its large steel doors were firmly locked, windows barred with thick metal rods, and heavy locks hanging everywhere, adding to its ominous appearance. "We are the police, open the door," an officer commanded loudly, but the only response was an eerie silence. Without hesitation, the police decided to break in. The loud crash of the steel door falling echoed as it revealed a pitch-black interior. A foul stench immediately hit them, forcing everyone to cover their noses. As flashlights illuminated the space, what they saw left the team frozen in shock. 6 emaciated women with vacant stares roamed aimlessly in the room, completely naked. Their feet were chained to the walls, and the heavy chains dragged across the damp, moldy floor, creating chilling, eerie sounds. One woman sat slumped on the filthy floor, her eyes glazed as the flashlight beam caught her. Another burst into maniacal laughter, waving as if greeting someone. In a dark corner, 2 women clung to each other, trembling uncontrollably, as if trying to shield themselves from an unseen horror. The officers quickly entered the room, attempting to provide the victims with temporary clothing. Upon closer inspection, they found the women's bodies covered in scars and fresh bruises, a testament to the abuse they had endured. Deeper inside, the police discovered broken bowls, spoiled food, plastic buckets filled with waste emitting a nauseating stench, and old, decrepit wooden beds. Oddly enough, the beds were topped with high-quality mattresses, a stark contrast to the surrounding squalor. A keen-eyed officer spotted a hidden path behind the main house. Under the dim light, the trail led the police up a gentle hill to a small, wooden shed concealed among dense trees. What the police uncovered inside was even more shocking: an array of torture devices, bamboo sticks, ropes, and medieval-like metal instruments. Continuing their search, the police found another woman lying on the ground. Her skeletal frame suggested extreme malnourishment. A preliminary check revealed she had been starved for 3 days, leaving her utterly debilitated both physically and mentally. At the same time, the homeowner, Li Jiachuan, was present, seemingly caught off guard by the arrival of the police. This house was not merely a prison, but a living nightmare. The women here were stripped of their freedom and treated like lifeless objects, entirely deprived of their basic human rights. Lang Nishing's testimony was verified. The house was indeed a hellish domain ruled by Li Jiachuan, where mentally ill women were enslaved to serve his and his accomplices' depraved desires. Authorities immediately secured the entire site. Li Jiachuan was arrested on the spot. He remained silent, but his cold, defiant glare left everyone unnerved. In the interrogation room, Li Jiachuan appeared calm, perhaps resigned to the inevitability of his fate, and began recounting his story with chilling composure. Born and raised in Tai village, Li Jiachuan was once the pride of his family. However, his laziness and violent tendencies soon led him down a path of crime. He quickly became a regional terror, notorious for his disruptive antics, brawls, and assaults on women. In 1971, at the age of 37, Li Jiachuan was sentenced to 3 years in prison for assaulting a local woman. However, prison did not reform him. Instead, it made him more cunning and ruthless. After his release, he delved deeper into criminal activities. In the late 1970s, he was arrested again for burglary and sentenced to another 5 years in prison. Disgraced by his actions, Li Jiachuan's family severed ties with him, banishing him from their home. From that point onward, Li Jiachuan lived a nomadic life completely isolated from society. In an attempt to survive, he took up fish farming at a small pond, hoping to rebuild his life. However, his laziness and tarnished reputation continued to haunt him. Unsurprisingly, his venture failed, leaving him destitute and desperate. By his early 50s, penniless, familyless, and utterly alone, Li Jiachuan sank into deep despair. It was during this time that dark desires began to fester within him, targeting homeless, mentally ill women, the most vulnerable and abandoned individuals in society. Initially, Li Jiachuan sought to fulfill his personal urges. He lured women into his home with false promises of food and shelter, only to imprison them in the hell he had created. It all started in late 1994, he confessed. I had just renovated my house and didn't know how to make a living. One afternoon, while fishing by the pond, I saw a young woman passing by. The woman, likely in her early 20s, was petite with unkempt hair. She wandered aimlessly along the deserted road near Tai village. I didn't think much of it at the time, he recalled. I approached her, pretending to be friendly, and coaxed her into my home with the promise of a meal. The naive woman followed him without hesitation. Once inside his house, Li Jiachuan locked the gate and shoved her inside. He handed her a bowl of cold rice and told her to stay put. But when she realized she was trapped, panic set in. She screamed, banged on the door, and tried to escape, but it was too late. I had planned for this, Li Jiachuan smirked. I tied her hands and feet with ropes and threw her into a corner. For days, the woman cried, screamed, and refused to eat. But Li Jiachuan was unfazed. He only brought her water and food when she was too weak to resist. After about a week, she stopped fighting back, he said coldly. When asked if he felt any guilt, his response was chilling. Why should I feel guilty, he shrugged. She was nothing. No family, no friends, no one to look for her. He admitted that his first abduction taught him how easy it was to control women like her. After approximately 6 months of captivity, he sold the woman to a nearby farmer as a wife. But this was only the beginning of Li Jiachuan's horrifying series of crimes. By the end of 1996, Li Jiachuan had officially turned his pondside house into a hellish brothel, catering to the depraved. He realized that mentally ill women were the perfect targets, defenseless, unsearched for, and easy to control. Whenever he captured a woman, Li Jiachuan meticulously assessed her ability to resist. If the victim appeared compliant, he kept her to serve his clientele. But if she was aggressive or caused trouble, he did not hesitate to sell her to human trafficking groups or remote farmers as a worthless commodity. Li Jiachuan's criminal network operated with an efficiency and sophistication few could have imagined. The women imprisoned in his main house were numbered like inventory. He charged a pittance, just 3 to 5 yuan per transaction, attracting countless elderly, widowed, or single men from the area. These clients frequented the establishment regularly but kept their activities secret, fully aware that what they were doing was illegal. A single slip could topple the entire system. Fear turned them into silent accomplices. To expand his operations, Li Jiachuan built an additional wooden house on a hillside behind the pond. This secluded spot became a discreet meeting place for clients from distant villages. The women held captive there lived in abysmal conditions. They were given the bare minimum of food and water to stay alive. Every day, they were forced to serve clients without any choice. If they resisted, they faced brutal beatings with bamboo sticks or other torture devices. The victims were shackled by their feet day and night to prevent escape. All doors and windows were reinforced with thick iron bars and heavy locks, making even a glimpse of the outside world impossible. To manage this system, Li Jiachuan hired Lang Ashing, a regular customer, as his henchman. Lang Ashing not only helped Quan oversee the captives, but also participated in abducting new victims. For 7 years, Li Jiachuan's atrocities continued undetected. His house was isolated on the village's outskirts, far from residential areas. Curious individuals who wanted to investigate were deterred by barbed wire fences and surrounding canals. Even the clients kept their mouths shut out of fear of implicating themselves. But every crime eventually comes to light. The downfall began in early July 2003, when Lang Ashing and a woman named Bing were arrested, bringing Li Jiachuan's reign of terror to an end. The collapse of the system stemmed from what seemed like an insignificant incident. Bing, one of the rare victims who escaped Quan's hell, attacked Lang Ashing in public, leading to their arrest. Initially, Lang Ashing was just a loyal customer, frequently visiting the pondside house where Li Jiachuan orchestrated his heinous activities. He wasn't just a patron, but was intrigued by how Li Jiachuan turned unfortunate women into profit-making tools. One day, drunk and emboldened, Lang Ashing expressed a desire to learn the trade from Li Jiachuan. He flattered Quan as a genius, someone who knew how to turn people into profitable commodities. This flattery stroked Li Jiachuan's ego, and he agreed to train Lang Ashing, provided he paid a mentor fee. From then on, Li Jiachuan began training Lang Ashing, teaching him step by step how to hunt for victims. He showed him how to approach mentally ill women at train stations, public squares, or bus stops without drawing attention. Most importantly, he taught him how to restrain victims without leaving any evidence. One day, Lang Ashing stumbled upon information about a shady private mental institution. In reality, it was a human trafficking hub disguised as a care facility. When families could no longer afford the fees, patients would disappear and be sold to individuals like Li Jiachuan. Lang Ashing quickly forged a partnership with the institution's administrator. He paid to acquire young women with severe mental illnesses who had no family visits. The institution even falsified records to hide the fact that these patients had been sold. The newly acquired women were swiftly broken down by Li Jiachuan through violence. They were shackled and turned into living commodities to fulfill the sick desires of his clientele. Beyond that, he sold them to remote farmers as wives or handed them over to human trafficking rings. The peak of cruelty came when Lang Ashing purchased Bing, a young woman with severe mental illness. Bing had been returned after being sold 4 times because of her violent outbursts. The institution wanted to offload her quickly, and sold her to Lang Ashing at a bargain price. On the way back, Bing's condition suddenly escalated. In the middle of a crowded street, she attacked Lang Ashing ferociously. This incident not only exposed him, but also led to the collapse of Li Jiachuan's entire criminal empire. Through investigations, the police discovered numerous women who had been imprisoned in the pondside house. Some were sold to remote farmers as wives, while others were traded multiple times. Shockingly, some women even gave birth in these horrific circumstances. On April 21, 2004, the trial of Li Jiachuan and his 17 accomplices commenced at the Intermediate People's Court in Maoming City. The case garnered significant attention due to its gruesome nature and astonishing scale. Li Jiachuan was charged with abduction, rape, human trafficking, and illegal confinement. He admitted to kidnapping at least 17 women between 1999 and 2003, but investigators believe the actual number exceeded 50. Other accomplices, including Lang Ashing and several men from the village, were sentenced to 3 to 4 years in prison. However, the leniency of these sentences outraged the public. Years later, Li Jiachuan was released on parole due to health issues. This decision further infuriated the public, who believed the justice system had failed to punish the wicked adequately. The public questioned how Li Jiachuan managed to sustain his operations for 7 years without being caught. Testimonies revealed that many local officials had turned a blind eye or even accepted bribes to protect him. Case 7. August 26, 1985. Employees at the SEPTA train yard in Frankfurt, Philadelphia begin their morning like any other. That is, until they stumble across the body of a woman between the rows of stacked railroad ties. Investigators quickly arrive to find a nightmarish sight that is so horrific and disturbing, it feels like they've stumbled into one of the crime scenes of the infamous Jack the Ripper. The victim is partially dressed, with her blouse open to expose her chest, and her legs positioned in a way meant to further demean her. She's been stabbed 47 times in the chest and head, including a deep slash across her abdomen that reveals her internal organs. There is no doubt that they are dealing with a murder, one that's been carried out by an extremely brutal and vicious killer. The victim is quickly identified as Helen Patton, with her ex-husband Kermit being called to confirm. Though the two were no longer married, they still shared a suburban home, living mostly independent lives, and Kermit explained that it wasn't unusual for Helen to leave without mentioning her plans, having last seen her a week before on August 19th. Despite the extremely violent nature of the crime, however, investigators struggled to find any evidence, any leads, or even any motives. All they had to speculate on was that Helen was a frequent visitor of several bars in the area, which perhaps could have been where she encountered whoever had attacked and murdered her. But the murder of Helen was only the start of the violence that Frankfurt was about to bear witness to, because what detectives didn't yet know was that they had just stumbled across the first victim of a serial killer who was about to spend the next 5 years terrorizing the neighborhood. In total, 9 victims would be discovered. All of them were white women who frequented bars along a specific 3-block stretch of Frankfurt Avenue, between Wakeling and Bridge Streets, and all of them were brutally attacked, stripped, and left in sexually suggestive poses. As a result, their killer would come to be known as the neighborhood of Frankfurt was once prosperous, but it had fallen into economic decline by the mid-1980s, deteriorating into a hub of crime, addiction, and prostitution. It did, however, have a lively nightlife of bustling bars that drew people in from all over, and it was this collective environment that unknowingly created the perfect hunting ground for a killer. On January 3, 1986, around 4 months after Helen's body was discovered, 68-year-old Anna Carroll was found lying dead in her bedroom, her apartment door having been left wide open. Though she had been stabbed fewer times, 6 in total, the mutilation was just as horrific, with her organs similarly exposed with a deep wound from her breast to her groin, and she was positioned in a similarly suggestive way to Helen. Although the murder occurred a few miles away from where Helen was found, and there were clear similarities between the two crime scenes, investigators didn't immediately treat the cases as connected. Although they did discover that Anna was known to frequent the same bars in Frankfurt as Helen, they didn't find this fact particularly remarkable. Not yet, anyway. One of these bars, located on the 5200 block of Frankfurt Avenue, near the train terminal where Helen was discovered, was called the Golden Bar. For over a year, the two murders remained separate open cases with no real leads, and after Anna's murder, there was an eerie silence. That is, until Christmas Day of 1986. On Christmas Day, neighbors discovered 64-year-old Susan Alshef dead in her Richmond Street apartment near Frankfurt Avenue, having been stabbed 6 times in the back. Just like the last 2 victims, Susan was a regular at the Golden Bar. But once again, police failed to connect her murder to the previous 2 cases. But then everything changed mere weeks later on January 8, 1987, when a 4th victim was found, and police finally started connecting the dots. Under a fruit and vegetable stand on Pratt Street, just off Frankfurt Avenue, and alarmingly close to where Helen was found, the body of 28-year-old Jean Durkin was discovered by a restaurant worker. Having lived on the streets for a number of years, Jean was known to frequently sleep in the doorway of an abandoned bakery just down the block from the Golden Bar. Once again, the crime scene was nightmarish, showing signs of unparalleled violence. A nearby fence and truck were both covered in blood, with Jean having been stabbed 74 times in the chest, back, and buttocks. Her body had been left partially nude, with her legs spread, and signs that she had been sexually assaulted. It seemed extremely clear to the press that the city was dealing with a serial killer, and the media began to demand action from the police, who had so far seemingly made no progress at all in any of the investigations. Finally realizing the cases were likely connected, the police set up a task force to investigate the serial killer that had begun to call the Frankfurt Slasher. With the Golden Bar being a direct connection to all 4 victims, investigators spent hours questioning a bartender who told them he had seen all 4 victims in the bar, including Jean, who frequently came inside throughout the winter months to stay warm. The bartender told them that Susan Alshef and Anna Carroll had both definitely been in the bar in the days before their murders, though he couldn't offer any specific dates or times. He did, however, suspect that the murderer might be as a result. Police questioned various regulars of the bar, but didn't uncover anything of interest. The more they looked into Jean, the more apparent it became that she would not have been an easy target for the killer. In one notable incident in the recent past, 6 police officers had attempted to arrest her, but she resisted so fiercely that they had to let her go. This led investigators to think that her killer may have been someone she knew, using charm rather than physical strength to overpower her. Similarly, it had been suggested that Helen, the first victim, would never have wandered off to the train tracks with a stranger, perhaps implying that she too had known or at least felt comfortable with her attacker. Police did follow a lead involving another woman called Michelle Daner, who had argued over a blanket with Jean the night before her murder, but ultimately found nothing connecting her to the crime. Towards the end of January, a crowd from the neighborhood gathered at the train station, holding candles in memory of the 4 victims. Despite the similarities in the murders, police were still not 100% certain the cases were actually connected, especially when no more victims were discovered matching the same pattern. However, any doubts they had would soon be laid to rest, as the Frankfurt Slasher was far from finished with his murder spree. A couple of weeks later, the frozen and partially clothed body of Catherine M. Jones, 29, was discovered. However, she had not been stabbed. She had been bludgeoned to death, with her skull having been crushed and her jaw having been broken. At the time, this case was seen as unrelated to the previous 4 murders, but it would later be suspected of being the 5th of the Frankfurt Slasher's crimes. After this, no further victims of the slasher were discovered, at least not until nearly 2 years later, in November 1988. In the meantime, a number of other shocking murder cases unfolded in the area that initially led authorities to thinking they may have found a suspect. For example, Gary Heidnik was arrested in April 1987 after a woman escaped from his house claiming he had held her captive alongside other women. This led police to raid his home, where they discovered 3 half-dead women he had been keeping as sex slaves. After his arrest, he admitted to eating pieces of his victims and feeding the remains to other captives. Not long after that, in August, Harrison Graham was evicted from his apartment only a mile away from Heidnick's home due to foul odors. Upon investigating, police discovered the decomposing bodies of 6 women, alongside the remains of a 7th. Graham initially tried to claim the bodies were there when he moved in, but later confessed to strangling the 7 women during sex. Bizarrely, it appears these 2 serial killers, who despite their similar crimes and actions appear to have had no connection to one another, were operating entirely separately at the same time as the Franklin Slasher in the exact same area. Because even if anyone suspected either of these men were actually the slasher, they were both imprisoned by the time he finally struck again. On November 11, 1988, residents of an apartment building on Penn Street close to where Jean's body had been discovered, stumbled upon a horrific scene in the building's foyer. The body of 66-year-old Margaret Vaughn, having been evicted from the same apartment building the same day after failing to pay her rent. Margaret was found having been stabbed 29 times and suffering a similarly grotesque fate to the previous victims, leading police to believe that the slasher had returned. But unlike the previous murders, this time a witness came forward claiming to have seen Margaret the night before she was killed. A barmaid saw Margaret drinking at her bar with a round-faced Caucasian man who wore glasses and walked with a limp. So police quickly put a sketch together, widely circulating it in the hopes that someone would recognize the man. Although they received numerous tips, none led to a viable suspect. Many calls they received were from elderly women suspecting their bus drivers, or from disgruntled neighbors pointing fingers at someone they didn't like. Some psychics also offered unhelpful advice, and one tip even suggested witchcraft might be involved. Although there was genuinely a cult practicing near a local park, this lead was ultimately dismissed. Authorities also had a lead on a suspect, a middle-aged white man, identified as a minister who worked in the area. However, he vanished during the investigation and was never heard from again. Ultimately, as with all the previous murders, no real evidence was discovered, and the investigation quickly hit a dead end. Then, on January 19, 1989, a few blocks away on Arrett Street, Teresa Ciortino, 30, was found stabbed 25 times in her apartment. An outpatient undergoing mental health care after years spent in psychiatric institutions, she was discovered nude, wearing only white socks, lying face up in a pool of blood in her kitchen. She had been violated with a piece of wood before she was stabbed and slashed across her arms, chest, and face. The killer left the bloodied piece of wood leaning against the sink, and even left a bloody shoe print this time. There was blood all over the apartment, indicating to detectives that an intense struggle between her and her attacker had taken place. Teresa was known to frequent the bars on Frankfurt Avenue, where she often entertained male companions. One of her neighbors recalled seeing her with a middle-aged white man at the Jolly Post Tavern the night before she was found, and shortly after another neighbor claimed to have heard a struggle in the apartment that same night. Because the murder took place so long after the last kill linked to the slasher, medical examiner Dr. Hoyer initially dismissed arguments that a serial killer was responsible, claiming serial killers typically strike more frequently, often within weeks. Despite this, police couldn't help but note the similarities between the victims. They were all white, they frequented the same bars in the same area, they had been violently assaulted, stabbed numerous times, and there was little to no evidence left at the scene. Police interviewed multiple patrons and employees of the bars the various victims had been seen in, but no substantial leads were uncovered. They even searched nearby sewers and bins, hoping to find a discarded murder weapon. But again, they found nothing. They did investigate a man who wore shoes similar to the print found at the scene who knew the victim, with some reports claiming he was her boyfriend, but they were unable to link him to the crime. Despite increased patrols and plainclothes officers observing women entering and leaving local bars, authorities failed to identify a solid suspect. By this point, they had already investigated over 50 men and had 2 under surveillance, with leads on a third. Yet the lack of a clear pattern in the killings made their investigation difficult. Investigators were baffled. How could someone commit such brutal, bloody murders, yet leave behind no trace of evidence, or never be seen presumably covered in blood? Suspects were arrested and released. Theories proposed and disproven, but no answers emerged. More than a year passed before the slasher struck again on April 29, 1990, when a patrol officer stumbled across the body of 46-year-old Carol Dowd in an alley behind Newman's Seafood in Frankfurt Avenue. Carol had been brutally mutilated, having been stabbed 36 times in the face, neck, chest, and back, and her face had been badly bludgeoned. Defensive wounds on her hands suggested she had fought back. Like some of the other victims, her stomach had been slashed open, spilling out her intestines. Though this time the slasher had also removed her left nipple. Once again her body was left positioned in a provocative manner. Her clothing and purse was discovered nearby in an alley, with nothing appearing to have been stolen. Because the patrol officer had previously been in the area investigating a burglary, it was estimated that Carol had been killed sometime between midnight and around 2 in the morning. Witnesses came forward claiming to have seen Carol with an older white man just hours before her body was found, matching the description of the suspect seen with the previous victims. Carol had a long history of mental health issues, having been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and spending time institutionalized. She had then struggled after being assaulted not long after her release. Though most recently she had been living in a community facility, where she had appeared to be happy and content. It seemed apparent that the killer was targeting particularly vulnerable women, almost all of whom suffered with mental health or addiction issues. The police were confident that Carol's killer was the slasher due to the similarities in the murder, despite the significant time that had passed since their last suspected attack. The crime also bore similarities to the murder of Catherine, leading police to suspect she was also a victim of the slasher. Theorizing that the killer was perhaps following his victims once they left local bars where he would abduct and assault them, led police to question employees of the nearby fish market, leading to a potential breakthrough in the case. Leonard Christopher, an African-American employee at the fish market who lived nearby, had previously commented on the crimes, calling the alley a prostitute's paradise and a hot spot for drug activity. Having known Carol, when questioned by police, Leonard volunteered that he had also known one of the previous victims, Margaret Vaughn, raising their suspicions. Being familiar with the area, and at least two of the victims raised red flags for the investigators, especially when he gave them inconsistent details about his whereabouts the night of the murder. He initially told them he had been with his girlfriend, but when questioned she contradicted him by telling them that she had been at home alone. Despite every sighting of every victim describing an older white man with them prior to their deaths, this discrepancy in Leonard's story led police to take him in for further questioning. And then an individual came forward claiming to have seen Leonard with Carol at a nearby bar the night she was killed, and two sex workers reported that they had seen him at Newman's around the time of Carol's murder, with one claiming that he was carrying a knife. Had the police finally found the Frankfurt slasher? Searching Leonard's apartment, police discovered a bloodstain on a pair of trousers, but at the time it was too small to be tested and linked to the crime. With all of his co-workers vouching for his character and defending him, they explained to police that the tiny speck of blood they found was from a previous burglary in the alley which Leonard had been ordered to clean up by their boss. Regardless, police formally arrested him on May 5th and charged him with robbery, abuse of a corpse, murder, and possession of an instrument of crime. They also denied him bail. On June 20th, it was announced that Leonard would stand trial for the murder of Carol Dowd, with the evidence against him being considered sufficient. However, this evidence was entirely circumstantial, and mostly centered on the two sex workers who claimed to have seen him that night around the time of the attack. One of these women, Emma Lee, stated that she saw him enter the alley where Carol was killed at around 1 a.m. before hearing a woman scream. However, she left with a man in a car shortly after, so didn't witness anything else. The second woman, Linda Washington, claimed she saw Leonard leave the alley with his shirt over his arm and a knife in a sheath hanging by his waist. Leonard's defense attorney tried to argue that the witnesses were unreliable and that some of the timings in their stories contradicted one another. He also argued that the robbery charge made no sense regardless, as there was money still in Carol's purse which more than likely had simply been dropped when she was attacked. Regardless of how lacking their case was against him, his arrest did finally bring a sense of relief to the community. But any assumptions that they were now safe were quickly dashed when another victim was discovered on September 6th, while Leonard was still in jail. Michelle Daner, 30, the same woman who had briefly been suspected in the murder of Jean Durkin after arguing with her over a blanket, was found dead in her apartment near Frankfurt Avenue, having been stabbed 23 times in the chest and stomach, near to where Carol had been killed, and on the exact same street Teresa was murdered. It seemed clear that she was yet another victim of the same serial killer. Yet the man police claimed to be behind the crimes was sitting behind bars. Like many of the other victims, Michelle suffered from mental health issues and was described as a paranoid loner who was known to act erratically. Like the other victims, she was a regular in many of the bars on Frankfurt Avenue, and once again, the night before her death, she was seen leaving a bar with an older white man. As you can imagine, her murder raised huge doubts about whether police had arrested the right person. Leonard did not match any of the consistent descriptions of the white man who had been seen with most of the victims before they were killed. Investigators knew they were dealing with a serial killer, but their circumstantial evidence only tied him to a single murder. Leonard, by most accounts, was a mild-mannered and well-liked individual with no criminal record or history of violence, and many people came out in his defense, claiming he had been wrongfully arrested by an inept police force who just wanted to close the case, and had consequently allowed the real killer to remain free to strike again. Despite all this, police remained confident that they had the Frankfurt slasher in custody, and claimed that Michelle's murder was likely carried out by a copycat killer. With such unsubstantial evidence against Leonard, this feels like a baffling claim to me. Regardless, on November 29, 1990, Leonard stood trial for the murder of Carol. The jury was never informed that another murder had been committed while Leonard was behind bars, and the information was banned from being discussed in the trial, despite police publicly accusing Leonard of being the Frankfurt slasher. Assistant District Attorney Judith Rubino painted Leonard as a ruthless murderer, using a Rambo-style knife to kill Carol Dowd in the alley behind the fish market where he worked. While Rubino acknowledged that there were no direct witnesses to the murder, she argued that circumstantial evidence was enough to prove his guilt. Witnesses had seen Leonard in the alley when Carol was murdered, heard a woman scream, and later saw him carrying a knife, and blood-stained clothing was found at his house. Rubino also pointed to Leonard's lies about his whereabouts on the night of the murder, and other suspicious statements he had made. In his defense, attorney Jack McMahon suggested that the pressure to solve the case had led the police to make a hasty arrest, potentially mistaking the evidence. Despite objections from the prosecution, he argued that there were 6 earlier murders in the area that all pointed to a serial killer, yet his client was only being accused of one of them. Many of the witnesses, he pointed out, were known to be prostitutes and drug users, with extensive criminal records and multiple aliases. One key witness, Emma Lee, had even admitted to lying to the police twice. McMahon also highlighted that when Leonard was arrested, there were no signs of injury on him, and that there was no physical evidence connecting him to the crime scene. No murder weapon had been found, no Rambo knife had surfaced. He urged the jury to question whether there was any real reason to view Leonard as a murderer. Rubino countered McMahon's defense by pointing out some unsettling details that make the whole situation a lot murkier. The morning after Carol's murder, Leonard had casually told his boss, Jossa Fong, that a white woman around 45 years old had been killed in the alley, even though the police had not released that information at the time. Rubino also highlighted a strange remark Christopher had made to Fong just days after the murder, stating, "Maybe I killed her." Though he quickly backpedaled, Fong remembered it vividly. She recalled how he had even mimicked the motion of gutting someone while describing the crime. He also claimed to have seen a white man matching the previous descriptions on the street at 1 a.m., but no other witnesses emerged to back him up. Fong testified that Leonard had been unusually anxious and rambling when he spoke to her about the murder. He claimed to be unable to sleep because he had witnessed it and feared that the white man who knew he had seen the crime might be trying to kill him. Leonard said the man might break into his apartment and hide in his closet. For physical evidence, the prosecution pointed to the tiny bloodstain found in Leonard's home, though admitted it was too small to be conclusively tested. DNA testing was still an emerging field at the time, and the technology wasn't able to analyze such minute traces. However, a bloodstained tissue was found near the building where Leonard lived, and it was identified as type O, the same blood type as Carol's. Leonard, however, had told police that while visiting his girlfriend's apartment, he had seen a well-dressed white man in his 40s outside, wiping his hands on a tissue. The problem was, Leonard hadn't been at his girlfriend's apartment that night, according to her. The trial wrapped up quickly, with closing arguments on December 11, in which the defense stressed Leonard's good character and the lack of a motive, weapon, or solid evidence tying him to the murder, or any of the linked murders. He pointed out that the description of the white man Leonard had given matched earlier witness reports of men seen with all the other victims. McMahon called the prosecution's case garbage, emphasizing that the violence Leonard was accused of was entirely out of character for him. Rubino, however, asked the jury to consider why the witnesses would lie, noting that some were friends of Leonard's, including one who had admitted to originally lying on his behalf to the police. Rubino also pointed out the testimony of witnesses who claimed to have seen Leonard with Carol in a bar the night she was killed, as well as the fact that his girlfriend testified that she did not see him that night, contradicting his claims. On the following day, December 12, the jury returned a guilty verdict, convicting Leonard of first-degree murder in the death of Carol Dowd. Some jurors, it was reported, appeared visibly shaken by the verdict. Leonard showed no reaction to the verdict, but his defense attorney shook his head in disbelief. While the prosecutor had requested the death penalty, Leonard was instead sentenced to life in prison. He maintained that he had been framed by what he called pipers, prostitutes manipulated by the police. Aside from his strange comment to Fong, He had never confessed to the crime at any other point, and never did even after his conviction. To the majority of investigators nowadays, it seems clear as day that Leonard was not the Frankfurt slasher, with police even conceding that while they think he killed Carol, they do not think he killed the other 8 women. Believing he was wrongly convicted in the murder of Carol, the Innocence Project picked up his case, but before they could offer him any real assistance, Leonard sadly died of cancer in prison. So was Leonard Christopher truly the Frankfurt slasher, or was he wrongly accused? Even after he was in custody, another body was discovered. Yet somehow he wasn't released and cleared of involvement, and the crime was dismissed as a copycat killing for no real reason. Many believe his conviction was driven by racial bias, with the media's sensationalized coverage fueling public pressure to resolve the case quickly. The verdict seemed more about appeasing the public than about true justice. As it stands, the Frankfurt slasher case is considered unsolved, even with the conviction of Leonard for Carol's murder. Leonard officially remains a suspect in the other 8 murders, but nearly 30 years later, he has never been tied to any of them, and no solid evidence linking him to the murder of Carol has ever been uncovered. While Leonard's statements to his boss are somewhat compelling evidence against him, it doesn't change the fact that he does not match the suspect's scene with nearly every one of the victims prior to their murders, and that there is no direct evidence linking him to the slasher's crimes. No motive, no murder weapon, no DNA, nothing. While it is possible that a copycat was responsible for the murder that occurred while was in prison, or that not all of the murders are actually connected, it's equally possible that they were all committed by the same individual, and consequently that individual cannot have been Leonard. No new evidence has ever emerged to shed light on the cases, but thankfully no additional victims have surfaced either. While the Frankfurt slasher was likely never caught, we can only hope that whoever was responsible is no longer active. Despite nearly 30 years having passed and the case having faded from the headlines, investigators have recently started to finally revisit the case in the hopes that DNA evidence and advanced forensic techniques might be able to crack it. For one, you'd hope the blood sample taken from Leonard's house could finally be tested with modern techniques to prove once and for all if it was or wasn't Carol's blood. Also, if you remember, I mentioned briefly earlier in the video that police had suspected a middle-aged white man who claimed to be a minister who vanished after being questioned. Before he disappeared, they actually managed to collect a DNA sample from him, which is now being re-examined using cutting-edge technology. But as the case remains an ongoing investigation, police have refused to discuss it and remain tight-lipped on their progress or any new findings. Attorney Marissa Bluestein from the Innocence Project is still investigating the case, despite Leonard's death, stating, "This is a man who spent the majority of his life in a prison cell for a crime that he did not commit." In a way, that bothered him more than the fact that his freedom had been taken away. Not only was Ms. Dowd never given justice because her murderer was never found and caught, but the other 8 women. Those murders are still unsolved. In October 2023, Raymond Wexel Jr., 51, while in jail accused of killing his neighbor and stabbing 2 inmates at the Blair County Prison, has claimed responsibility for the 9 murders, making the claim that he was the Frankfurt slasher. Whether truthful or not, his claims are currently being investigated by the Philadelphia police. But as far as I'm aware, there have been no new announcements since the initial coverage of the situation back in 2023. It's worth pointing out, Wexel would have been a lot younger at the time than the suspects seen with many of the victims. The victims of the Frankfurt slasher are part of a broader pattern where marginalized women are especially vulnerable to violence, including murder, in the United States. Most of the women targeted in this case were known to frequent areas notorious for drug activity, and many were suspected to have drug addictions, with some even potentially being involved in sex work. The truth about the Frankfurt slasher may never be known. What is clear is that the case, filled with unanswered questions and lingering doubts, remains a haunting chapter in Philadelphia's history. Case 8. Female victims. He's been shot in the abdomen, as well as through into the hand. Police said the 6-year-old brought a handgun to a first-grade classroom and deliberately shot the teacher. This was not an accidental shooting. It's hard to imagine that someone so young could commit such an unthinkable act. Yet throughout history, children, some barely old enough to read, have turned their schools into scenes of violence. These are 10 of the youngest school shooters in history. It's over. Everything's over. It's done. Nothing matters now. These were the haunting words of Kipland Kip Kinkle, spoken after committing an unspeakable act that left a small Oregon town in shock. Now, before we dive into what he did, who was Kip Kinkle and what could have driven him to such a dark place? August 30th, 1982. Kip was born in Springfield, Oregon to William and Faith Kinkle, both high school Spanish teachers. Now, his childhood wasn't exactly smooth. In 1987, the Kinkle family spent a year in Spain, which kind of disrupted his early development, and adjusting back to life in the States was tough for him. School in particular was a challenge. Kip struggled with things like motor skills and spelling. Eventually, his parents had him tested, and he was diagnosed with dyslexia. And for Kip, this made school a place of frustration rather than growth. And as he moved into middle school, things wouldn't get better. Instead, Kip began spiraling out of control. In 7th grade, he and some friends bought bomb-making manuals like the Anarchist Cookbook. And by 8th grade, he was shoplifting CDs from Target and secretly buying a sawed-off shotgun from a friend. And of course, this wasn't just him trying to be rebellious. There were signs of something deeper. January 4th, 1997. Kip's issues with authority kept growing, and it would come to a point when he and a friend were arrested for throwing rocks at a car. Now, although both were charged, they would avoid juvie detention. And following that, Kip would start seeing a psychologist who diagnosed him with major depressive disorder. But despite regular therapy, his behavior didn't improve much. April 23rd, Kip was suspended for attacking a fellow student. And just a week later, he was suspended again, this time for throwing a pencil at another student. In this attempt to help him, Kip's doctors prescribed Prozac. After that, it seemed like things were looking up, but not for long. June 27th, Kip's parents wanted to channel his energy in a more positive direction, so they let him buy a gun, hoping that lessons in gun safety would make a positive difference. But just a month later, Kip secretly bought a semi-automatic pistol and hid it from them. At the start of the school year, Kip enrolled at Thurston High. He started off pretty well, even joining the football team. And to encourage his progress, his father gave him a semi-automatic rifle and a hunting knife, believing that Kip was finally turning a corner. But in reality, Kip was fooling everyone, and his troubles were far from over. Around this time, a series of school shootings would take place across the U.S., and it seemed to ignite something dangerous within him. So he began planning his own attack. May 20th, 1998, Kip was caught with a stolen loaded handgun at school. A friend had stolen it from another friend's father and sold it to Kip the night before. He and his friend were arrested, but released later that day. Kip's father picked him up, and he was furious at him. He warned Kip that if this behavior didn't improve, military school was next. That conversation would be their last. Once they got home, Kip, all filled with rage, took a rifle from his room and shot his father in the back of the head. He dragged that body to the bathroom, and hours later, when his mom arrived home, Kip would say a chilling "I love you" before killing her as well. The next morning, Kip dressed in a trench coat, hiding multiple weapons. He then walked in a Thurston High and opened fire in the cafeteria. 2 students died, and 25 others were injured, before Kip was subdued by fellow students and eventually arrested. But even in custody, the violence wouldn't stop. While being held at the station, Kip managed to pull a hidden knife and threaten the officers, even trying to cut his own wrists. But the officers disarmed him using pepper spray. By September 24th, 1999, Kip, just 15 years old at the time of the attack, was charged with 58 felony counts, including 4 for aggravated murder and 26 for attempted murder. Defense psychologists argued that Kip was suffering from serious mental health conditions, including undiagnosed paranoid schizophrenia, and claimed that if these issues had been looked into, the tragedy could have been avoided. Regardless, Kip pled guilty to all charges. He was given 111 years in prison, with no possibility of parole. While this prosecution was successful in doing what needed to be done, namely forever protecting society from Mr. Kinkle, there are no winners in this incident. October 24th, 2014, the halls of the Marysville-Pilchuck High School in Washington were forever changed. 15-year-old Jalen Freiberg, once the life of the party, committed a horrific act that left 4 of his peers dead before he turned the gun on himself. Just a week earlier, Jalen was a homecoming prince, standing tall, flashing a smile as his classmates cheered him on. He was popular, well-liked, and even the star of the football team. Everyone thought he had it all. In the eyes of his friends and teachers, Jalen was the kindest of people you could root for. He was ambitious, caring, and driven. And he wasn't just a star athlete, either. Jalen was a proud Native American and a member of the Tulalip tribe. and those close to him believed that he had a bright future as a tribal leader. So frankly, no one could have guessed what was coming. Following the tragedy, one of his classmates summed up the disbelief felt by so many. But apparently there was more to Jalen than most people saw. On the surface, everything looked fine, but social media would show stories from friends, hinting at something that might have been brewing beneath his confident exterior before he finally exploded. You see, a few weeks before the shooting, Jalen had gotten into a fight after someone made a racist comment towards him. He was suspended from school, adding tension to what seemed like an already fragile emotional state. And then there was the breakup. Jalen's Twitter feed in the weeks before the tragedy was filled with heartbreak. In one of his last tweets, he wrote, "It breaks me. It actually does. I know it seems like I'm sweating it off, but I'm not. And I never will be able to." And his final tweet, posted just the day before the shooting, was chillingly simple. "It won't last. It'll never last." Still, no one saw it coming. On the day of the shooting, Jalen seemed fine. He even chatted with friends at a football practice and exchanged handshakes, showing no signs of the darkness building inside. But then, everything changed in the cafeteria just hours later. At the time of the shooting, there were around 150 students in the cafeteria. When the first shot was heard, nobody could believe their eyes. There stood Jalen, gun in hand, firing into a group of his friends. In total, 4 of Jalen's closest friends were killed, and several others wounded. The vice principal immediately put the school on lockdown. But by then, the damage was done. Jalen would finish this off by turning the gun on himself and end his own life. In the aftermath, the focus shifted to his father, Raymond Freiberg Jr., who had illegally purchased the gun used in the shooting. Raymond had lied on the background check, concealing a history of domestic violence, which legally bars him from owning firearms. March 2015, he pled not guilty, but was eventually convicted of illegal possession of firearms and sentenced to 2 years in prison. But does it matter? The shooting shook the community to its core. Students, teachers, family members all were left grappling with the question, how could someone so beloved, someone with so much potential, commit such an unthinkable act? November 30th, 2021, started like any other day at Oxford High School in Michigan. But by the time the clock hit 12:50 p.m., everything changed. 15-year-old sophomore Ethan Crumbly walked out of the bathroom with a 9mm SOC Sauer handgun hidden in his backpack. Without warning, he opened fire in the hallway as students rushed between classes. By the time the shooting stopped, 4 students were dead and 8 others, including a teacher, were injured. Another tragedy that shakes the nation. And what made it all more heartbreaking was that there had been warning signs. Clear ones. Earlier that very day, a teacher had found a disturbing drawing on Ethan's desk. It showed a gun, blood, and the words, "Help me." The thoughts won't stop. His parents, Jennifer and James Crumbly, were called to the school for an emergency meeting. But instead of taking their son home, they left him there, even though they knew about the gun they had just bought for him. And just a few days before the shooting, the school had reached out to Ethan's mom. After he was caught looking up ammunition on his phone, she brushed it off, even texting him, "LOL, I'm not mad at you. You have to learn not to get caught." No one took the steps needed to stop what was coming. That November day, when Ethan's parents left school, they had no idea that their son had already hidden a gun somewhere on the premises, ready to carry out the deadly plan he'd been working on for months. Now later, during Ethan's trial, the court heard how he had meticulously planned this attack. In a chilling manifesto recorded the night before the massacre, he declared, "There's no God, I'm the demon. I'm gonna open fire on everyone in the hallway." Jesus. He'd even recorded a video stating, "My name is Ethan Crumbly, age 15, and I'm gonna be the next school shooter." Now the courtroom also found out that Ethan's troubled home life was pretty bad. His parents had a history of run-ins with the law, including DUIs and fraud, and they were known for neglecting him. When Ethan was young, many neighbors reported that he was often left alone while his parents went out drinking. By 2021, things took a darker turn when Ethan's only friend moved away and the family dog died. Texts to his mother became more disturbing, filled with talk of demons and ghosts. He started torturing animals and sketching out his plans for a school shooting. Yet, despite all these red flags, his parents never sought help for him. So now, following that shooting, Jennifer and James Crumbly were both charged with involuntary manslaughter, becoming the first parents in the U.S. to face criminal charges for their role in a school shooting. They were given 15 years in prison, eligible for parole after 10. December 2023, Ethan was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Before the court, he apologized to the victims' families, saying, "Any sentence that they ask for, I ask that you do impose it on me because I want them to be happy, and I want them to feel secure and safe." Yet, of course, his words did little to ease the pain of those who lost their loved ones. At the end of the day, actions speak louder than words. September 28, 2016. In the early hours of the morning, 14-year-old Jesse Osborne stood in front of a mirror, combing his blonde hair, and recorded a video. He cracked a dark joke to the camera. Just hours later, Townville, South Carolina would be forever changed. In their home that morning, Jesse Osborne shot and killed his father, 47-year-old Jeffrey Osborne, who had allegedly been abusing Jesse for years. Jesse then drove his black pickup truck 3 miles to Townville Elementary School, where he had once been a student. By 1:45 p.m., he crashed into the school's fence, got out, and fired a .40 caliber pistol into the air, shouting, "I hate my life." Moments later, Jesse scaled the fence and opened fire on the school's playground. Students and teachers were scrambling for safety, but one student wasn't able to escape, Jacob Hall. He was shot in the leg, and the bullet caused massive blood loss, leading to cardiac arrest. Despite being rushed to the hospital and undergoing surgery, Jacob died 3 days later. Jesse's attack only ended when his gun jammed just 12 seconds after he pulled the trigger. A volunteer firefighter at the scene tackled and restrained him until police arrived. During interrogation, Jesse broke down, calling his grandparents to tearfully confess to what he had done. Now, what led to this tragedy? Well, you see, in the months up to the school shooting, Jesse had been going downhill. He'd previously been expelled from middle school after bringing a hatchet and a machete onto school grounds. At the time of the shooting, he was being homeschooled, but that would do little to tame his violent tendencies. The internet searches would show a disturbing obsession with mass shootings, more specifically that 2012 Sandy Hook Elementary shooting, and he would even discuss his plans online in a chat group filled with people interested in mass killings. Jesse talked about how Townville Elementary didn't have cops, and that he could get there within 4 minutes, and he initially planned on killing 50 or 60 people. In the end, Jesse Osborne pled guilty to 2 counts of murder and 3 counts of attempted murder. November 2019, he was given life in prison without parole for his father's and Jacob Hall's death, and 30 years for the attempted murder charges. Jesse has appealed multiple times, and finally in September 2023, Jesse's 2 life sentences were modified to 75 years each. Now, this adjustment allowed him to participate in prison programs that were previously unavailable to inmates serving life without parole. February 2nd, 1996, 14-year-old Barry Locatus walks into his middle school in Moses Lake, Washington, dressed like a gunslinger. Hidden under his coat were 2 pistols and a high-powered rifle. This day would end in tragedy, with 3 people dead and several others traumatized by the violence they witnessed. Born February 26, 1981, Barry had a really turbulent childhood. He spent his early years in Iowa and Minnesota, before moving to Washington with his family when he was in 5th grade. But his home life began to unravel with his father's affair on one side, and his mom's mental health problem on the other. His mother would often speak about killing herself, and even suggested that they both end their lives together on Valentine's Day in 1996. Now, many wondered if this home environment pushed Barry over the edge. Barry himself would later say that the relentless bullying at school and his problems with clinical depression were what truly led to his violent outburst. Now, that fateful morning, rather than taking the bus to school, Barry chose to walk. With every step, he moved closer to the horrifying act he was about to commit. He walked inside his algebra's classroom and drew his weapon, shooting and killing his teacher as she stood there in front of the chalkboard, still holding onto the eraser. He then turned the gun on his classmates, killing 2 students, one of whom had bullied him, and injuring another girl by shooting her in the arm. For a brief time, Locatus took hostages in the classroom. But this would all end with one brave teacher, John Lane, who entered the room, helped evacuate the wounded, and tackled Barry to the ground, holding him there until police arrived. By September 1997, Locatus was convicted of 2 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. He was given 2 life terms without the possibility of parole. But his story didn't end there. In the years following his sentencing, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that juveniles, those under 18 at the time of their crime, couldn't be given automatic life sentences without the chance of parole. So in 2017, Barry returned to court for resentencing. For the first time, he publicly apologized for his horrific acts. None of this should have happened like that. And it was because I was stupid, because I was pathetic, and because I was weak. Despite this, the court upheld his punishment, sentencing him to 189 years in prison. December 1st, 1997, the calm of a typical school day at Heath High School in West Paducah, Kentucky, was shattered when 14-year-old Michael Carneal launched a tragic attack, killing 3 girls and injuring 5 others. Now, Michael was a B- student with no major disciplinary issues, but beneath the surface, he was struggling and didn't have many friends. He often tried fitting in by bringing items to school to sell, even resorting to stealing to gain friendship. Yet, unfortunately, his small stature and physical weakness made him a target for bullying. And to make matters worse, a gossip column in the middle school's newspaper claimed that he had feelings for another male student, leading to a barrage of name-calling that only intensified his isolation and hatred. So in the weeks leading up to the shooting, Michael stole a .38 handgun from his parents' room, hoping to sell it. But a fellow student would take this gun from him, threatening to inform the authorities unless Michael handed it over. That experience, combined with his earlier attempts to connect with peers, deepened his sense of helplessness and frustration. And around that time, Michael had also started telling students that something big is going to happen, but no one would take him seriously. And as November rolled around, Michael stole 2 shotguns from his father's closet and hid them under his bed. And with a chilling determination, he prepared to carry out his plan. On that fateful December morning, he wrapped the shotguns and 2 pistols in a blanket, claiming that they were part of an art project he was working on. Once at school, he put in his earplugs and pulled a pistol from his bag. Without hesitation, he fires 8 rounds into a youth prayer group, a moment of chaos that left a lasting impact on everyone present. But when Michael saw his friend, Nicole Hadley, fatally injured, he placed his pistol on the ground and surrendered to the school's principal, Bill Bond. In the aftermath, Michael Carneal was charged with multiple counts of murder and attempted murder. December 16, 1998, he was given 3 concurrent life sentences for the murders, along with an additional 120 years for the attempted murders and burglary. So after spending 25 years in prison, Michael had applied for parole. He claimed that at the time of the shooting, he felt like he was in a dream, and that voices in his head urged him to commit the violent act. Remember firing the gun, or how many times I fired it. But the next thing I remember is people laying on the ground. September 26, 2022, the parole board unanimously denied Michael's request for release, ordering him to serve the remainder of his life sentence. Under Kentucky law, this ruling means he'll no longer be eligible for future parole hearings, effectively turning his life with parole sentence into life without it. September 4, 2024, everything changed at Appalachia High School in Georgia to the point of no return. A 14-year-old boy named Colt Gray walked into the school and opened fire, killing 2 students and 2 teachers. Chaos erupts as students and staff rush for safety in the football field, while police swarm the campus. Once Colt realized he was surrounded, he didn't put up a fight and surrendered to the school's officers as they approached him. During that deadly attack, he used an AR-style rifle, the kind we often see in school shootings. But why would a 14-year-old have access to such a weapon, you ask? Well, that gun was a Christmas gift from none other than his father, Colin Gray. And now Colt faced 4 counts of felony murder, and his father was arrested too, charged with second-degree murder, involuntary manslaughter, and cruelty to children for allowing his son to have a gun. But this incident left everyone asking one heartbreaking question. Why? Even though Colt gave himself up quickly, the reason behind the shooting still remains unclear. No one knows if he was targeting specific people or if it was all random. Now what we do know is that Colt's life at home wasn't too easy, and this wasn't his first encounter with trouble. A year before the shooting, when Colt was only 13, the FBI received tips that he'd been making threats on Discord, hinting at a school shooting. When they questioned him, Colt denied it. His father also assured authorities that their guns were locked up and Colt didn't have access to any of them. And so the investigation wouldn't go any further because they couldn't link Colt directly to the threats. And Colt was really struggling at home. His parents had separated, and his father admitted Colt was often picked on at school. Now his mom, Marcy Gray, had noticed her son wasn't himself in the months leading up to the shooting. And just 6 days before, she called the school, hoping to get Colt admitted to a treatment facility. Colt agreed, but sadly, it wasn't fast enough. On the morning of the shooting, Colt sent 2 chilling texts. One to his mom saying, "I'm sorry, Mom," and another to his dad telling him, "You're not to blink for this." His mother was terrified when she saw the message and immediately called the school. But by then it was too late. In the days after, she described her disbelief and heartbreak, going on to say that when she first heard about the shooting, she fell to the ground and just screamed, knowing deep down it was her son. The grief, guilt, and shock hasn't left her since. And now Colt faces life in prison, and because he's a juvenile, he's not going to get the death penalty. His father's also awaiting trial, and investigators are re-examining their previous encounters with the family, including the FBI case from a year earlier. But at the end of the day, the community was broken. People are asking if this could have been prevented, and most importantly, how could a parent let their kid have access to such dangerous weapons? A school shooting in Serbia has left 8 students and a security guard dead. The suspect, a 13-year-old male student. May 3, 2023, Belgrade, Serbia woke up to devastating news. A chilling call came into the police with the caller, a boy with a young voice, saying, "I'm Kosta Kizmanovic, and I've just shot several people." Just an hour earlier, 13-year-old Kosta Kizmanovic walked into his school as if it were any other day, but this time he had a malicious plan in mind. Armed with a gun, he shot the school security guard and 2 female students in the hallway, before entering a classroom and opening fire, killing 7 more students and wounding 5 others. Afterward, he calmly walked to the schoolyard and called the police to confess. Now, due to his young age, Kosta was never charged with a crime and was instead placed in a psychiatric hospital. Investigations showed that he had planned the attack for a month, selecting his targets and mapping out the classrooms he'd enter first. His father, a respected radiologist, had taken him to shooting ranges, and the weapons used in the massacre were legally owned by the family. Now Kosta had a privileged background, and he was never really bullied, but still the tragedy unfolded. His parents were arrested shortly after, and his father faced charges for allowing Kosta to access firearms and take him to a shooting range, while his mother was charged with criminal neglect. She said that she saw nothing unusual in Kosta's behavior that morning, aside from him being slightly lethargic at breakfast, and when she first heard about the shooting, she believed that her son was a victim, only to be faced with the terrible truth upon arriving at the scene. Her son had killed 10 people. July 2023, Kosta testified against his father, admitting he'd been taught to shoot, and that his father admired his accuracy. He also shared that his fascination with video games and this mass murder documentary contributed to his dark thoughts. Kosta did express regret for his actions, claiming that he had changed his mind and felt remorse for the shooting, and if he could turn back time, he wouldn't do it again. But for the families of the victims, that was a little too late, and well, in the eyes of many, Kosta Kizmanovic hasn't faced real punishment for the lives he took. And despite the tragedy, he'll even get to continue his education, and maybe even have his whole life ahead of him, something his victims don't get to do. August 2023, Kosta's mom reached out to institutions, requesting arrangements for both him and his younger sister to continue their schooling through online education because he's in a psychiatric facility. On the teachers' council at Kosta's former school, Vladislav Ribnikar voted to expel him, but Education Minister Slavica Dejanovic explained that expulsion wasn't within the council's power. Instead, Kosta can continue his studies at Dragan Herzog Elementary School in Belgrade, a special school for students with health-related issues. The school's director confirmed that Kosta would resume his education there, though the exact format is yet to be determined. March 24, 1998, an unimaginable tragedy unfolds at Westside Middle School in Jonesboro, Arkansas. 2 boys, Andrew Golden, 11, and Mitchell Johnson, 13, planned and executed a deadly shooting spree, leaving 5 people dead and 10 more injured. Now these 2 weren't particularly close, but their bus rides back and forth were enough time for them to develop a bond over some sinister intentions. Andrew, the quieter of the 2, appeared to be a model student. He was well liked by teachers and peers, and he had a passion for shooting, often going to the range with his family. However, beneath that polite surface lurked a sadistic side. He loved shooting animals with his BB gun, and he would find his match in Mitchell, who was known to be a bully at school, and often talked about wanting to join the Bloods. Throughout this meticulous planning, the boys managed to steal 9 firearms and approximately 2,000 rounds of ammo from Andrew's grandfather, and then proceeded to execute the next phase of their evil scheme. After parking a van full of supplies for their escape in the woods behind the school, Andrew pulled the fire alarm, sending students and teachers rushing outside, and as they did, the two would open fire from the tree line, aiming at their unsuspecting classmates and teachers. In just 10 minutes, they had killed 4 students and 1 brave teacher, Shannon Wright, who had died while shielding a student from the bullets. They would injure 10 more before police arrived and arrested them. Despite the horrific actions, neither Andrew nor Mitchell could be tried as adults due to their ages. They were sent to juvie detention until they were 21. Both were released in their early 20s, Mitchell in 2005 and Andrew in 2007. Now Mitchell continued to be a criminal. He was arrested multiple times for drugs, theft, and fraud, and ultimately served more time in prison as an adult now. Andrew, on the other hand, attempted to live under the radar, even changing his name to Drew Douglas Grant, as he would try to obtain a concealed weapon permit. His past, however, caught up with him, and his application was denied. Following that, Andrew mostly avoided public attention until karma finally caught up with him. July 27, 2019. He was driving on a highway in Arkansas when he crossed the center and fatally crashed into another car. The 2 drivers would tragically lose their lives, bringing a sudden end to a life defined by violence and destruction. Police say a 6-year-old boy, a first grader, somehow got a hold of a gun and opened fire at his teacher, critically wounding her. January 6, 2023. The unbelievable occurs at Rich Neck Elementary School in Newport News, Virginia. A 6-year-old boy brings a gun to school and shoots his teacher, Abby Werner. When this tragedy happened, it was a typical afternoon, and Abby was teaching her little first graders. The 6-year-old, who had been displaying concerning behavior for some time, pulled out a 9mm handgun, pointed it at his teacher, and fired. The bullet pierced Abby's hand and lodged into her chest, yet somehow, despite the pain, she managed to get her students to safety before collapsing. The boy got that gun from home, where it was allegedly kept locked away by his mom, Deja Taylor, who would later face charges for child neglect and gun-related offenses. The story raised a lot of questions about how such a young child could carry out such a violent act, and it reignited debates over gun safety, parental responsibility, and sadly, school security. Also, before this fateful day, there had been warning signs. The boy had behavioral problems. He would act out, curse at staff, and even physically harm his teachers. Abby, along with the other staff, was concerned after he threatened to beat up a fellow student and even show another student the gun. Yet, despite these red flags, the administrators told the staff to wait out the situation. And as the investigation into the shooting unfolded, the attention shifted not just to the boy, but the failure within the system to allow such a tragedy to happen. Abby ended up suing Newport News School Board for $40 million, citing the administration's negligence. The school's assistant principal, Ebony Parker, who had been informed of the potential threat, was later indicted on charges of felon and child neglect. Deja Taylor, the boy's mother, also took responsibility for the incident, acknowledging that her son had taken her gun, which she thought was securely stored. She faced both state and federal charges, including making false statements about the weapon and unlawfully possessing a firearm while using marijuana. November 2023, Taylor was given 21 months in prison for her federal offenses and an additional 2 years for child neglect.